Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams Tea Podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And today, we're coming at you with a new Jams and Tea Now episode where we talk about everything in terms of the goings-on in the world of music, where we talk about new releases, new music, new announcements, and stories. We talk about what we've been listening to, and this week's special theme for our episode is that we are going to be talking about bad albums, notoriously bad albums from artists who are otherwise good and that we have a lot of affinity for. So we've got no shortage of things to talk about today. I am currently in the midst of a statewide power outage up in the Midwest because of tornadoes, which is why you didn't see my face on the Gorillaz review. So
Yeah,
fun times are happening.
I had a lot of fun. I was just trying to, when I was editing that, I was saying, what do I do with this? And I was like, what do I do with Jay here? And I just decided I'm gonna just remove his feed completely, and I'm gonna put the gorillas, the jumping gorillas guy, where your feed would be.
I think our
Just to
friend Saoirse kind of hit the nail on the head when she said I looked like an NFT, like it was presented like that. Like that
yeah,
is absolutely the kind of
that's
vibe you give off. Thank you,
that's
Damon.
yeah.
And
So
of course, if you haven't seen our video this week, we talked about the newest album from Gorillaz, Cracker Island, as well as the other fucking what have we
the new
fucking
album
talked
from
about?
Algiers.
Oh yes, the newest album from Algiers. We talked about Shook. Good discussion on both of those. Check
We
those out. We also
we got a
had a
retweet. We
new.
got a Before you get into that, we got a
Oh
retweet
yeah,
for
yeah, yeah.
Algiers as well. Nice acknowledgement from them, which was really great to see, because I thought that was a really because I was really satisfied with that review as well,
I
especially
was as well.
coming off the back of the Gorillaz album, where we were just kind of toasting it for 40 minutes. And so it was nice to really dig into a record that made us kind of think a little bit and think about how we approach albums. But yes,
Yeah.
as you were about to say, it's
Oh,
been a great week for the channel as well, because we had a very successful video that Jake, you worked really hard to create, and I worked really hard to
uh,
edit. So it was a true collaborative
thank you
effort.
everyone who has watched my Susumu Hirasawa video. If you are not familiar with it and you don't know who Susumu Hirasawa is, good. Go watch it anyway because the video is for you. I have been working on this for a while now. We've talked about getting into the music of Susumu Hirasawa over the course of the past couple of months. And so I did a sort of discography ranked video, but it's also within the framework of a guide showing people where they might want to start based on their specific proclivities, and I get a little bit more into the weeds with some of the emotions that this particular discography invokes in me towards the end there. It's a very special
Yeah.
video. Thank you to everybody who's watched it. If you haven't watched it, go watch it. If you've watched it already, go watch it again. It's a good video. It's probably my favorite single solo video I've ever made, and Ryley did a great job editing it. So
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing, regardless of whether you are familiar with Susumu Hirasawa or not, won't matter. The video's accessible either way. But the one thing you will definitely come away from this video certain of is that Guts' theme from Berserk is one of the greatest pieces of music ever created.
that's goddamn right.
All right, so let's get into the week in music news. Dipping back a little bit as well, because we didn't do a now episode last week, so we're kind of catching up a little bit more to talk about. But thankfully, a lot of the most juicy and interesting stuff is pretty recent and relevant. First thing I want to talk about is that music Twitter, rate your music Twitter, and all forms of millennial and zillennial hipsterdom had a fire lit under their ass this week when Danny Brown and JPEGMAFIA announced that they're working on a
Yeah.
collaborative album. There was some controversy, or not controversy, but there was some divisive reactions to the title of said project, which is the amusing Scarin the Hose Volume 1. And look,
Brilliant title for the record.
like there was a lot of people clowning the title because they thought it was just, really, really corny and stuff. But I mean, to that I say, have you ever heard the music of either of these artists
I
before?
was gonna say, like, this is totally on both of their alley, like to the point where if you proposed a name for a JPEGMAFIA and Danny Brown album collaboration, like there is no other name this can have, like
Yeah.
truly.
Yeah, and not to mention the fact that they didn't release a single properly, but in the announcement on Danny Brown's podcast, they did tease a song. They played a snippet of a song, and that song was called Lean Beef Patty. So, I mean, these aren't good. You're
Please,
not getting.
please, God, let us get 2 Danny Brown projects this year.
Oh,
Please, by the grace of God, let it happen.
well, yeah. The crazy thing is that, and I am definitely inclined to call bullshit here because, artists promise these kinds of things all the time and never deliver.
Uh-huh.
But Danny did say that apparently that he and JPEGMAFIA both have 3 records supposedly in the works currently at the moment, aiming to be released, this year or
Isn't
within the
there the
vicinity.
collab album? Isn't it like the subtitled with Volume 1 or
Yeah. So
something like that? So
yeah. But apparently Danny did say that he and Peggy separately have 3 records in the works, like 3 of
I
their
believe
own
that at
individual
least
records in the
Peggy
works.
definitely does.
So, and we of course are waiting on Coranta, the new Danny Brown
Hmm.
solo record as well, which has been teased for a while. So we'll see. The way these things tend to go, artists don't tend to release more than 1 record in a year if they can avoid it, just because it sucks. One will suck air away from the other one, but
Hmm.
I'm ready for it. I can handle it. I would like for it to happen. Something cool that happened this week as well. We finally had the release of De La Soul's music onto streaming services.
Yeah.
Very long awaited. Of course, we were talking about the passing of Trugoy, the Dove, just what was it, 2 weeks ago now, and this
Yeah,
has
something like
finally
that.
happened as well. So it's been great to see people, you know, people I follow on Twitter and just general, especially younger people as well, discovering these records, being able to go beyond. I mean, for a lot of people hearing 3 Feet High and Rising for the first time, which of course is very
Hmm.
significant, but also people going beyond that and listening to records like Balloon Mind State and
Balloon
Stakes
Mind
is High.
State and stuff. Yeah.
So it's great to see that music finally getting the exposure that streaming can provide it, especially in an era where, it's not exactly easy to get a hold of things physically anymore, especially records that are. I mean, I can't imagine any of these albums have been pressed in a long time either. So,
Hmm.
so definitely go and check those out. Take advantage of that, not just to pay tribute to Trugoy, but also to educate yourself in the catalog of one of the most important hip hop groups of all time. So that was awesome to see. And more interesting to me news as well. Big Thief played Stephen Colbert this week, and they
New
debuted.
song.
Well, they played a song called Vampire Empire, which they played when I saw them in December, and which I
Oh.
recorded. And you can watch a performance of that song in the video that I released on this channel, my concert review of the Big Thief show. The version they played on Colbert was slightly truncated as well, probably because it was a performance on a talk show. But it's a great song. I I feel like I know it inside out now. I've just heard it so many
Hmm.
times, and it hasn't even been released yet. So I'm curious to see how whether it turns out to be on their next record or not, whether we even get teasings of their next record yet. I mean, the fact that they're already playing new songs, the fact that they were on Colbert and chose to play an unreleased song tells me that they've probably been working on another record, which is just, it shouldn't be that surprising considering they have released 2 albums in a year before. But I
Yeah.
mean, I still feel like the generous bounty that was Dragon New Worm Mountain is still, processing in my digestive tract. So,
That
it's
I
really
mean
awesome.
that is an album that could feasibly be any lesser artist only album, and it would be like, yeah, I'm
I
satisfied.
mean, yeah, it's like it's a whole career's worth of music. And so yeah, Big Thief remain, one of my 5 favorite bands, and I'm really excited to see uh what happens next. I mean, how quickly it happens next. But go and check out that performance. Go and check out the performance that I is in my video as well, because I think the performance I recorded is slightly better and longer. So, little plug there. But a great song. Great to
Suck
see
it,
Big
Stephen
Thief.
Colbert.
Yeah. um, Another very minor but amusing piece of news that I saw this week is that no, I'm always, whenever I see the word Lizzo flash up and when I'm scanning through news items on Stereo Gum or whatever, my eye immediately is drawn, because whenever Lizzo's in the news, it's always for a good reason. It's always for a fun reason. It's always for a reason that will make me happy that I discovered it. And this was something that actually did make it to Twitter as well, which was great to see. Is that Lizzo played a show in Germany this week. She specifically was playing in Hamburg, I'm pretty sure, and she decided to whip out a cover of legendary industrial nu metal band Rammstein's song "Du Hast," which she
What?
completely threw herself into. Like it's an
Fuck.
absolute joy to watch her perform this song, going absolutely crazy, twerking to Rammstein, which is honestly fitting considering, some of the stage antics that band are famous for, many of which
Uh-huh.
involve genitals. Um, in fact, there was a clip.
Everything I find out about Lizzo is like increasingly I just like her more every single time I find something out about her. Like the fact that she like throws ass to Rammstein,
Yeah.
that's is there a more based pop star working? I don't think so.
Yeah. She also, I don't know if it was at the same show because she's touring Europe at the moment. I guess she's using this as an excuse to be silly. But there was another show where
Got a little silly with it.
she did she paid tribute to another incredibly meme worthy moment that happened in pop culture in the last few weeks at the BAFTAs. There was the now infamous, I guess, celebratory rap from Ariana DeBose paying tribute to all of the women
Angela Bassett did
nominated.
the thing.
Yes, paying tribute to all the women nominated for Best Actress at I'm pretty sure it was the BAFTAs. And of course, which spawned, a number of great moments and lines. But of course, Angela Bassett did the thing, which Lizzo herself acted out at her Amsterdam show, which is just another amazing detail from her story. So yeah, if you ever get a chance to see Lizzo live, from what I can gather, she makes it worth it.
Hell yeah.
I'm just completely enamored, and she's just so good at feeding us material to talk about in both the news and in her music herself. A lot of albums celebrating notable anniversaries this week as well, to the point where I've been very indecisive as to which anniversary we should celebrate with my record club pick this week. I've settled on the Magnolia Electric Company by Songs Ohio, the famous project of one Mr. Jason Molina, who of course passed away long ago, but his most significant and beloved album turned 20 the day before we record this, actually. So we're going to do a record club on that very soon. That'll come out in a couple of days from when you're seeing this. But other albums that notably celebrated anniversaries this week as well, I'll go in kind of increasing order of significance. First of all, I want to shout out, also the day before we record this, Waxahachie's album Cerulean Salt, an indie rock classic of 2013, turned 10. I love that album. Hadn't thought about it in a long time, but I saw the anniversary announcement, went back to it. It's just incredible, especially thinking about how much this particular artist has influenced so many of the big indie, solo female singer-songwriter artists that we talk about all the time. It's not that they wouldn't exist if not for Waxahachie, but she preceded them in a huge way and is definitely one of the most significant figures of early 2010s indie music. So her album Cerulean Salt, not even her best record. I mean, she's put out a lot of great records. I'm really, really fond of American Weekend and the one she did after Cerulean Salt, which its name is escaping me. But yeah, big ups for that record. Big fan of it. Want to put my 2 cents out there. Another album that celebrated an anniversary this week, a very significant emo record that I had not heard up until this point. And as soon as I saw the anniversary, I'm like, okay, I've been looking for an excuse to listen to this. And the album is called The Ugly Organ, by the emo post-hardcore band Cursive. And so I was expecting, okay, I had listened to the album that Cursive put out before this, which is called Domestica, which is like one of the most, I know brutal is kind of an overstatement, but it is one of the most uncomfortable emo records. It's a record where the frontman is writing explicitly about an incredibly painful divorce that he's experiencing, and very, just describing in painful detail the circumstances and the experience of going through that. And it's very, well, the thing about Cursive is that they're from Omaha, Nebraska. They very much came up along the Saddle Creek scene alongside Bright Eyes as well, and they bear a lot of resemblance to Bright Eyes. But Cursive is kind of like the the darker, older brother of Bright Eyes. Where Bright Eyes draws from sort of elements of folk and elements of Americana, and even at the darkest moments of Bright Eyes, like on a record like Fevers and Mirrors, there's still this sense of kind of tradition of music coming through that makes it feel that it is like it's tethered to artists that are more familiar and that are more approachable. Whereas Cursive don't have that bright spot. Cursive are just, they're much more taking from post-hardcore. They're much more taking from, the grimier 90s stuff and bringing that into the world of emo. And so, yeah, Domestica came out in 2001. I'm pretty sure that was their ugly, the ugly album that the frontman wrote about his divorce. And I mention all this context because The Ugly Organ, which I listened to for the first time this week, and Domestica left me cold because I felt legitimately uncomfortable listening to it. It felt as though it was crossing some kind of line that I just couldn't quite get behind. Even if a lot of what it was doing musically very much fit in with the things I like in emo, it just felt uncomfortable. And so I checked out The Ugly Organ, and this is one of the great meta albums that I've ever heard. And to be frank, without beating around the bush, this is one of the best first listens I've had all year. Especially from being cold on the album that preceded it, this blew me away. This was, I honestly almost came close to giving this a 10 after one listen. It's a very, very powerful album. And essentially what it is that frontman, the same person who wrote very explicitly about his divorce on the previous record, essentially writing a whole bunch of songs about what happens when you write a record about your real life pain and you essentially involve people from your real life in your songwriting process. You write about your, ex-wife in this case, you write about your suffering and you bring other people into that world involuntarily and what the consequences of that are. The real world consequences of when an artist uses their life and uses their work and uses people in their lives without consent to mine meaning and to have success and achieve, greatness and all this sort of stuff. What are the actual personal consequences of that? And The Ugly Organ is one of the most brutal albums about self-deconstruction and tearing yourself down and completely just essentially ripping your soul out and saying none of this means anything. And it's kind of hard for me to explain what he does on this album, but it's just some of the most gut-wrenching meta lyricism I've ever read on any album. This is someone who has sold their soul for commercial success, has gotten a fraction of that, and has had that come with so much suffering and so much pain to their loved ones, and essentially is making a record about the state where that has left him. And yeah, it's a powerful record, especially to listen to in the context of a lot of the problematic and in many cases outright toxic artists that have come both before and after this particular artist, who have similarly mined their personal suffering and in many cases the pain they have inflicted on others for artistic value. And I thought a lot about Brand New while listening to this album, especially because there's musical similarities there as well. And it's, while at least to our knowledge anyway, the frontman of Cursive has never done anything as horrendous as Jesse Lacey or any of the other figures you might think of when you think about the post-Warped Tour reality of all these post-hardcore and emo bands. It's just an album that really kind of peers back and doesn't, just completely rips apart all of the supposed profundity and meaning and greatness of the angsty white male mid-20s songwriter. Just completely takes that stereotype and that archetype, completely tears it to shreds and just kind of stamps all over it. So it's a really powerful album. Highly recommend it. One of the best things I've heard all year. Ends with a 10-minute post-rock song that reminded me of M83. It's a wild album. Check it out. It's sick as shit. So I don't mean to spend so much time on that, but you know what I'm like. Great album. Turn 20. Check it out. And also want to shout out as well that John Cale's Paris 1919, which I was also considering making a record club. In fact, I did up until changing my mind. Turned 50 this week as well. One of my favorite chamber pop albums of all time. contains two of my favorite chamber pop songs of all time, Child's Christmas in Wales and the title track. I mean, personally, I like it more than any Lou Reed or Velvet Underground album, but that's a very me personal take. It's just a beautiful chamber pop album. It's gorgeously arranged. It's absolutely immaculate lyrically, because it takes this huge metaphorical construct, which is essentially that it's about the post World War I fallout of Europe and the Treaty of Versailles, and this sort of situation where essentially the borders of Europe were completely redrawn, and all of the situations that would lead to World War II and the deaths of millions and millions of people were essentially established, and uses this metaphor, or uses this as a metaphor for, all kinds of aspects of political satire, social satire, personal crisis, all kinds of stuff. John Cale's a really fascinating and literate and great songwriter. And it's just not the kind of record you expect the guy who's playing his cello like he's trying to tear it apart on the first Velvet Underground album to make.
That was what was the most surprising thing about it to me, is that when I thought about, like, I had never even heard a John Cale solo album up until this week. And so when I listened to it, I was just like, I knew like the genres that it inhabited, but I expected it to be a lot more just abrasive or unfriendly. But the two sort of focal points for comparison I kept coming back to were like Man Who Sold the World era David Bowie and early Elton John. Like, if you are a fan of those in any respect, this is like 100% your shit.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think the lyricism is the greatest draw for me. I think that it's just one of the most beautifully written albums I've ever heard. Even if a lot of it is, ultimately about things like, shallow things like cocaine or whatever. There's just so much.
There's a song called Hanky Panky Know How.
Yeah, absolutely. But and also when he sings it, it sounds genuinely devastating, those words, which are ridiculous. But also the string arrangements in general. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot this week, and I think that the title track in particular, the string arrangement on that song, the way that it swells in its chorus especially, which is one of my favorite choruses of all time. In that moment, I can imagine Jeff Lynne of ELO hearing this song, and that basically dictating his entire artistic output for the next 10 years. Every ELO record, almost every single ELO song from El Dorado through to Time is basically an attempt to write his own version of John Cale's Paris 1919. And I mean, he got there on multiple occasions. I mean, most significantly with Mr. Blue Sky, but many, many times. And I was listening to this album this week. I was struck by how wide of a net its influence casts across so much of singer-songwriter music in general, but basically any music that tries to bridge together the worlds of pop with writing of sophistication, not to be pretentious, but also ornate chamber instrumentation as well. It's such an influential record, so deserves to be celebrated for its 50th anniversary, and use it as an excuse to check it out for yourself and see where you fall. A lot of new singles that came out this week that I want to shout out as well, or in the last couple of weeks that came out. First, and the one that I feel like we have to mention right off the bat, because anytime this artist and or any of its constituents release anything, then we're obliged to, it's like a bat signal, essentially, and we must heed the call, which is to say boygenius released a new song this week. It is actually
fucking great. Like,
it's my favorite of the songs that they've put out for this new album so far.
Yeah, same.
It is paired with a music video that I highly recommend checking out, because it is just the most wholesome shit you will ever see in your life. It is literally just holiday footage of Julian, Phoebe, and Lucy just having fun for 4 minutes. And it's a gorgeous song. It's a heartwarming music video. It got me really excited again for the boygenius album. I am curious to see how this thing hangs together as a full-length proposition with these three disparate artists. But I mean, this to me feels like such a perfect synthesis of their spirits, as well as
those
sound.
First three singles really oriented themselves around each of them individually. Like, I feel like each of the first three boygenius singles were like, one of them really had like an authorial voice in them. This is the first song of the four that feels like a perfect blend of all of them. Like even instrumentally, emotionally, like sonically, everything about it just feels exactly what you would want when you imagine what this like the people who've been waiting for the full length boygenius album for as long as that EP has been out. This is the kind of song I feel like people have been waiting for.
Absolutely. Yeah, like I said, I just can't say it any more succinctly or effectively than that. It is the best song they've put out for this album so far. I adore it. You know, I've listened to it a bunch. It's beautiful. I hope that the next one they release is either Leonard Cohen or Revolution Zero, just because I love the idea of calling a song Leonard Cohen or Revolution Zero.
Julian Baker releasing a song called Leonard Cohen is just like, damn.
Maybe like
really
that's
fucking
the point.
on the nose.
That's
it's like if
point.
Connor Oberst made a song called Bob Dylan. Like, yeah. Jesus Christ.
That's the point where you just like need to take a step back and maybe retitle it. But also I appreciate just going gung-ho into it.
The sincerity.
Yeah, for sure. I want to shout out as well. Okay, this is maybe my favorite. Not the best song that's been released this week. I'm saving that for last because it's very predictable. But the most entertaining song that's been released this week as a new single, something that I was just heavily anticipating because of the band in question, the name of the song, and the way that they were choosing to publicize it. I am, of course, talking about the lead single for the new album from Sparks. The Girl is Crying in Her Latte, which is the name of the album that they're releasing on I think the 26th of May. And it's the lead single as well. Has a music video featuring the immortal Cate Blanchett doing some incredibly
Lydia
sick,
herself.
Yeah, doing some incredibly sick dance moves while wearing this kind of like, full on bright yellow kind of tracksuit with these sort of clown shoes that I love. Her whole aesthetic's amazing. And she's just doing this the whole time.
It's so good.
Dancing like that. And the song itself is, it's sparked. It is bizarre. It is led by this buzzsaw synth that completely threw me the first time I heard it. It sounds like something off of I don't know, like a noise record or like a Merzbow by way of Death Grips or something, very online like that.
I thought of Death Grips.
And then it's paired with, just think about Sparks, and you don't really appreciate this until you listen to a lot of their music. A good way of speed running that, by the way, is by watching Edgar Wright's fantastic documentary on their discography, which is basically just the world's most high budget, deep discog dive ever made. But anyway, a thing you get to understand after you listen to a lot of Sparks music is that their whole shtick of writing these kind of unconventionally clunky lines that don't really feel like they work in this sort of poetic rhyme and rhythm and meter and how we understand classical lyricism to work. They're just deliberately aloof and very strange, but there's something about the charisma and just the sheer, transfixing energy of Russell and Ron Mael that just brute forces it into this territory of working. It's so strange. It's so hard to explain why it works because it's just on the face of it, there's very few elements in the song. It's very minimal. And the elements that are there don't really feel like they had any clear relationship with each other. It's a strange song, but I really like it. I really think that it's an intriguing lead single for Sparks. I respect, of course, the decision to have your lead single be a song with 3 elements max, including the vocals and a straight up buzzsaw synth sound, with Cate Blanchett doing goofy ass dances. Look, I am really excited for this record, more than I thought I would be, just because the whole energy of this and just again the pure ridiculousness of the album title, "The Girl is Crying in Her Latte," which once you hear the song, by the way, is a phrase you will never be able to get out of your head.
Yeah.
It's so sick that Sparks are still making this kind of bizarro music and are making no concessions whatsoever, especially given, the renewal of fame they had when the Edgar Wright documentary dropped, in conjunction with Leos Carax's Annette as well, which is basically the realization of, a project they had spent literally 3 decades working on. The fact that following the success of those things, they're still committed to being as bizarre as possible and using the clout they have now to get Kate Blanchett in to just, you know, do nothing but
Do
drop
some
sick
weird
moves.
shit.
I fully appreciate it, and it has won me over completely. Last new single I want to mention, best song of the week, in my opinion. Shouldn't be a huge surprise given the artist in question, who is one of the most celebrated artists on the show. I feel like we've talked about him a few times already this year for one reason or another. But of course, Mr. Jason Isbell and the 400 Unit have announced their release, the upcoming release of their new album Weather Vanes in June. And they dropped this lead single, Death Wish. It is the lead single and the opening track of their new album, Weather Vanes, which is, by the way, over an hour long. So we're eating with this upcoming record.
Yes.
First time I heard this song, I liked it a lot. I thought, okay, this is another great Isbell song. You know, he's leaned with reunions, especially. It felt like he was leaning away from the kind of more sparse, sort of intimate singer-songwriter Americana music of his early solo era and kind of moving into something a little bit more sort of fuller in sound. And he appears to be continuing that here. But the second time I heard this song, it just was like a light switch clicked, and I went from being, okay, yeah, this is a great Isbell song, to this is a fantastic song in general. Like Isbell here dealing on themes that are not unfamiliar as well. You know, the feeling of being in love with someone, or the feeling of having a connection to someone, whether family or whoever, who is heading down a path that's not healthy, or is heading down a road that makes you fear for them. And, you know, the helplessness of being in that situation as well, but the kind of, you know, Isbell's healthy, mature understanding of that situation and his ability to, you know, sagely reflect and choose the best path to both support that person and keep yourself, you know, in a healthy state of mind. It's a gorgeous song. It's beautiful. It has that real energy that you would expect from this newer era of the 400 Unit. I'm completely in 100%. I love this track. I want to hear I want the whole album now. You know, it's just driving me nuts that it's
sound wise, it's even got a bit of a Drive-By Truckers kind of rougher Southern rock bent to it that I really like, and have, you know, not to say that his other music released in between, like when he was doing work with that band and what he's done recently, I've been missing that aspect, because what he's done has been amazing. But this is a facet that I've been waiting for him to re-explore again.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm 3 months feels like forever to wait at this point, especially for such a generous offering as well. It's definitely the longest record Isbell has made since his time with Drive-By Truckers. So can't wait for this. Been listening to this song an awful lot lately, and we're going to be on our shit when this album drops. Like, this review is going to be, I mean, the album drops on the same day as the new Godflesh album, which was also announced this week, which is like the first Godflesh album in 7 years. So I'm really fucking excited for that. And I was just thinking to myself, that's going to be a really fun pair of records to review in June.
Morgan ass week.
Yeah, we're just going to be completely in our element there. So yeah, really excited for those. We lost a few major artists this week. I always dread these segments, but I'm kind of getting to the point where I can sort of reframe it as a positive. You know, we can't obviously we can't change the fact that they've died, but we can turn that into something, into an excuse to celebrate them. And, you know, I'll build up to the biggest one. I'll start with one that got kind of overshadowed by the death of a, you know, more famous artist, but definitely was gutting, and especially because this particular person was, I think, only in his 50s when he passed away. Steve Mackey, the bassist from the legendary Britpop band Pulp, a band that I've always had a really strong affinity for, and a band that's always stuck out to me as being particularly not super underrated, because they were really, really appreciated at the time, but they've kind of got retrospectively
underrated now,
a little bit buried retrospectively in some of the bigger Britpop bands. But, you know, because albums like His and Hers, Different Class, and This Is Hardcore are all great. And
I'd say Different Class is maybe my favorite, like, Britpop album straight up.
That's a very respectable take. I mean, it's a phenomenal record. And, everyone gets caught up in Jarvis Cocker talking about Pulp because he is such a commanding and idiosyncratic presence. But you don't have a great pop band, especially a Britpop band, and especially a band with such obvious indebted influence to the world of American rock music and funk music and all kinds of the prevailing influences that have poured through into Britain from the 70s and onwards. You don't have a good band doing that kind of music without a good bassist. And Steve Mackey took on that role with complete enthusiasm and charisma. I mean, there were loads of tributes this week from people who knew him, who talked about what, apart from being an amazing musician in that band, what an absolutely beloved and warm and wonderful human being he was. And what an absolute beacon of light he was in a scene that could be very toxic and could be filled with a lot of pessimism and ugliness. So a big celebratory shout out to Steve Mackey, and may you rest in peace. Go and check out a Pulp record this week, pay your respects, and remember, one of the great pop bands of the UK from the late 80s, early 90s era, but also it's irreplaceable and fantastic bassist. I want to shout out a death that only happened, I think, the day before we record this. And this was someone who I will admit, despite the fact that I am actually familiar with a lot of the records that this person has played on, I did not have this person's name committed to heart. So I'll happily own up to this. But the great session guitarist David Lindley died yesterday or the day before we record this, a few days ago from when you're listening to this. David Lindley, if you don't know his name, like I didn't immediately recognize it, you'll absolutely, most likely, if you have any interest in classic rock and Americana, an actual Americana from the 70s and 80s, and in the world that has, the world of influences that have spun all the way off from the 60s and 70s folk and rock and roll scene, you will have probably heard Lindley at one point or another. Lindley is most famous for being in the psychedelic band Kaleidoscope, but he's more known for his session guitar work, not just playing the guitar as well, but a number of different instruments as well. He was a massively talented multi-instrumentalist. His most famous collaborations were with Jackson Browne on many of his solo records, but he's also played with Crosby and Nash, performed on Linda Ronstadt's biggest albums, he's played with James Taylor, has played on Bob Dylan records from the late 80s and early 90s, played with Springsteen on his albums, played most notably, and the connection that I'm most familiar with him from, he's played very consistently on the albums of Warren Zevon across his career as well, played with Curtis Mayfield, Dolly Parton, Toto, so many different other artists as well. I mean, you look through his credits, you look through the albums that he's been on, and it's not just, oh my God, he was on that, but it's also often just a case of, wow, he was playing, like, he wasn't just, giving some guitar licks or doing a hired hand solo. He was actually contributing a varied instrumentation in a lot of cases as well. He's a big part of the musical background of Leonard Cohen's Songs for Leonard Cohen album, which is his big breakthrough classic record. As I mentioned as well, he played on almost every single Warren Zevon record, played with Ry Cooder on many records, including the soundtrack to Wim Wenders' Paris, Texas as well. He's a big element of that too. So David Lindley, a massively influential and a massively huge part of the fabric and language of American rock music through its imperial era and beyond. Biggest loss this week, one that is just huge for the world of jazz music, huge for the world of, I would even say, popular music in general, even if
certainly
he was mostly localized to specifically the jazz world. But of course, we lost Wayne Shorter this week. At the absolutely respectable age of 89, I mean, no one can deny Shorter lived a long and incredibly productive life, not just in the imperial era that he is most known for, but throughout the 70s, 80s, and beyond, as well as a continually innovating figure. There is a case to be made that he is the greatest jazz saxophonist of the second half of the 20th century, possibly. I still need to continue to educate myself in some of the bigger names from earlier than that point to really kind of make any declarative statements, but no one is going to deny that Shorter was one of the most important musicians of the explosion of jazz in the post-bop era and through into the fusion era as well. I mean, he's of course probably most known for his collaborations with Miles Davis in the Second Great Quintet, but also beyond the Second Great Quintet as well. He played on Bitches Brew and many of Miles' most beloved records. But he also was a great arranger and band leader in his own right, has an incredibly prolific and innovative solo career as well. I listened to a number of his solo albums this week, particularly Speak No Evil and Night Dreamer, two incredibly significant albums from mid-60s jazz that are immaculately arranged. I had the privilege of watching a jazz band perform songs from Night Dreamer just the night before I record this as well, and that was a very emotional experience to see how electric Shorter's compositions are when they're actually being demonstrated in front of you. But also beyond his own solo work and his work with Miles and into the Weather Report as well. One of the most significant and influential fusion bands who were incredibly prolific through the 70s and into the 80s as well. An incredible band. I listened to their album Heavy Weather this week, as well as a couple of their other tracks from other records too. An amazing influential body of work. I mean, that's probably some of the most commercially successful and significant music that he made, especially, you know, once the Weather Report evolved to incorporate Jaco Pastorius on bass in that era that I was talking about around the time of Heavy Weather.
He played on a Steely Dan song, didn't he?
Yes. I can't believe I almost forgot that, considering what a huge Steely Dan fan I am. Of course, Wayne Shorter played both of the incredible saxophone solos on the title track of the album Asia, two of the best sax solos ever laid to tape. That song as well is just incredible. And I mean, what else can you say? I've said a lot of words on that before already in my Steely Dan video, but Shorter's contribution to both, you know, real jazz heads music, but also the extent to which jazz bled into the public and pop consciousness beyond its, you know, imperial eras into the modern era is so incalculable and so amazing. So yeah, massive shout out to Wayne Shorter. A few little albums I thought we could talk about. We'll still have time to do a couple of what we've been listening to highlights, but I want to talk about a few albums, just two albums actually, that have come out that I know that you and I have both heard, and I figure would be best to kind of have separate here before we get into our individual what we've been listening to. First of all, I want to shout out the new live album from Black Country New Road. Which came out this week and has, you know, generated a lot of buzz, generated a lot of attention. People have been talking about it. People are hugely into it. It is, what's notable about it as a live record from Black Country New Road, of course, if you're familiar with the story of this band in any form, you will know that just before the release of their most recent album, Ants From Up There, which came out in February of last year, frontman as Isaac Wood announced his imminent departure from the band. And of course, he was the primary songwriter. He was the sole vocalist or the chief vocalist. He was the whole kind of character and personality of that band to a huge extent came from him. So it was a huge shock when he announced he was leaving the band, and it left a lot of questions up in the air as to where they would go from there. Now, BCNR fans, correct me if I'm wrong here, but from what I can gather, the band have quite boldly sort of responded to this by, in all the shows that they've been playing since then, not playing any material from their first two albums at all. Just that we've completely retired those songs for whatever reason, you know, whether they feel that they just belong to Isaac too much to continue performing them. And again, that might not be completely true. I've just heard from a secondary source. So if they are still playing some songs, definitely correct me. But at least as it pertains to this live album anyway, Black Country New Road have responded to the departure of their frontman by doing just one of the most Giga Chad moves of all time, and it's being like, well, forget it. Let's just write enough material to do a live album that is completely new songs. And they've done that. Their new live album is all new material, without exception. And it showcases how the band have responded to this massive shift in the nature of what the band are, to emphasize one of the core elements that kind of made them stand out in the first place, which was their intensely collaborative nature within themselves. You know, this is a band, a lot of fucking people in this band. You know, I'm not gonna, I consider myself a huge fan, and I still couldn't tell you confidently, if you were quizzing me for money, how many people are in Black Country New Road. There's a lot of fucking people in Black Country New Road. and they don't all play at once, but they've really channeled that spirit into these new songs as well. I mean, they're easily recognizable as being the same band that made those first two records, but they have continued to sort of branch out what they do. They've evolved far beyond the, I say rudimentary, but not in a derogatory way, because I love their first album, but it is comparatively quite rudimentary, slint influenced post-punk with post-rock tendencies, and all the klezmer, with all the klezmer music that they put in there, all this stuff, cool stuff, but they've completely shifted and they've reoriented themselves, and you still have the prominent brass and woodwinds, and it still feels very much like a bunch of band geeks to a certain extent who've kind of just sort of coalesced into this project. But these new songs are very expansive. They're incredibly beautiful. They're very varied. There's no real unifying thread between all of these songs in terms of what they are and what they sound like. Other than that, they sound like Black Country New Road. There's multiple vocalists now. Tyler and May from the band are both sort of trading vocal duties from one song to the next on this live album as well. They both have a very arresting presence that feels very much fitting to the kind of music they're making. But Jake, I mean, I'm curious what your thoughts were on this live album and the new material that BCNR are offering up that we can only assume will be on their next proper album.
Well, somewhat notoriously, I guess, is that, I was the one person on planet Earth who didn't really care for Ants from Up There. And so even though I my feelings have slightly waned on their first album, that's still an album I really like, and I was curious as to what direction this band was going to go in. So listening to this, I was somewhat apprehensive, honestly, just because I was like, is this going to be a case of the same old thing happening all over again? Because, despite the fact that Isaac's departure has clearly yielded a new phase for them, it's not like they're just going to suddenly become a completely different band just because he's gone. And that's certainly, they are identifiably the same band that made the last album. But much to my own shock, I pretty much loved everything on here. Honestly, I think that their confidence as composers and arrangers, whether or not this was made concurrently with the previous material of the band, whether or not it was after, point is, on here, everything feels like it fits together in a way that I respond to a lot more. I think that the comparisons I kept coming back to a lot of the time were, more recent Regina Spektor records were a lot of the influences on here, a lot of Baroque pop kind of stuff. But there's something about the sort of triumphant tone to a lot of these songs that just really feels earnest and felt, and I absolutely love the new vocal presences on here. I think they're fantastic on songs like the two highlights, and probably my two favorite songs from the band in general are I Won't Always Love You and Laughing Song, which I think are just, if those make it onto a studio recording that comes out this year, next year, whenever, those are going to be Song of the Year contenders. They're terrific in their live incarnation, but the only thing that this leaves me wanting is I want to know what this sounds like once, they go into the studio, just because a little bit of my problem with Ants from Out There was the production on some tracks. And that's the funny thing, is that this live setting kind of obfuscates that and gives the sort of like raw, more live band feel that I appreciated on the last record, but was sort of inconsistent within the qualities of each specific song. But here, since it is a live record, that kind of eliminates that problem somewhat. So I'm curious to see what they do with this material, if anything at all. They're the kind of band that I could see, like, they could announce a new album tomorrow and not a single song on this live album can make it on there, like, for all we know. But I'm just really intrigued, and it's nice to be on the same page as everybody with this band again, because I'm just elated to feel excited about it again.
They've been pretty good, to be fair, about sort of satisfying fans and delivering their music in terms of like the stuff they play live. Up until this point, basically all of it has ended up on an album, I think. So I'm fairly confident that this is like a Swans thing, because what Swans do is that they record live. They record shows from their tours, essentially, where they're essentially playing material from that they want to record on their next album, and they use the sales of the live album to actually finance the recording of the next album. And this feels kind of like a little bit like that as well. I imagine that BCNR have enough backing to already be able to afford to record their new album, but I feel like this is that kind of situation where this is essentially just going to be, the next album is just going to essentially be all of these songs, probably rearranged, and probably with some significant changes, because this is a band that are known for doing that. But yeah, I was thoroughly engrossed with this. I second the shout outs for I Won't Always Love You and Laughing Song. My favorites were, that aside from those two, were Dancers and Turbines especially, which is this like epic sort of 10-minute post-rock song that ends with this massive climax that feels very over the top and ridiculous, but also just so satisfying
in the best way.
Yeah, so I was really taken with this as well, and I think it's really promising. Other notable significant album release I want to shout out that I know that we're both heard and I know that we're both into is the new album from Model/Actriz, Dogsbody. Now, this is a project that sort of started generating waves after it initially came out as well. Got a Best New Music from Pitchfork and is currently ranked, I believe, at #1 on the Album of the Year chart on Rate Your Music as well. So a lot of people are into this. Model/Actriz is a Boston-based noise rock and by way of dance punk band led by frontman Cole Hayden. To describe what this band do, I mean, it's kind of a little bit like the frontman Cole Hayden has a little bit of a Jamie Stewart presence,
certainly,
from Shoo Shoo, but the instrumentals are more akin to like, I don't know, like proper early 2000s dance punk bands, like, I think a little bit of early LCD Sound System or The Rapture or Death from Above 1979, but like by way of noise rock and some of the more modern versions and aesthetics of noise rock. I thought of a band like The Armed, as well as bands like Chat Pile and all that kind of new class of bands. It's a really fascinating melting pot of different influences. It's an incredibly unique sounding album. It manages to feel simultaneously like completely of a piece with this massive wave of bands that come through, post-punk adjacent, noise rock adjacent. And our hit rate with these bands tends to be like 50%. Half of them we completely love, and then half of them kind of just whoosh over our heads. Like for every Chat Pile, there's an equal and opposite gear band, for instance. And so Model/Actriz have come along, and this new album, Dogsbody, firmly fits in the plus tier, the plus side of that equation for us. We're both really into this. Jake, I'd love to hear what you think of it.
The way I would describe this to people is that, to me, this is Block Party by way of Bauhaus. There's a distinct kind of gothic flair to this whole project, and honest to God, like this is an album that just like, I'm kind of like retroactively upset that this isn't a band that's been around for longer so I can hear what their sophomore album sounds like, because this is a very quintessential debut record for like a new band with a newer kind of sound. And I can't emphasize enough how thoroughly filthy this album is. And not only in the sense that it's like, it's noisy noise rock, it's also immensely aggressive and really sexual, like very, very like, and also just like explicitly very queer.
Oh, yeah.
And in a way that I find really transfixing. Like lyrically, it is very like in your face in that respect, but it's all in very slanted metaphor. It's all in very evocative pieces of imagery that really stick with you. And along with the fact
that I always think of, like the most notorious, I guess, memorable lyric on the album, body count higher than a mosquito.
That is about, I was going to say, that is maybe my favorite song hook of the year so far. I've been like walking around and being like, with the body count higher than a mosquito. It is proper head banging shit. That's the base appeal of this band to me, is that they know how to make a great hook. They know how to drive it into the ground, and they also have a really great grasp on album construction. This is a tight 38 minutes, and like for the most part, I'd say about 30 of that give you exactly what you're looking for in terms of that noise rock stuff. And then there's a little bit of the album that it veers on the more atmospheric side of things. I've been listening to a little bit of Liars this week, and honest to God, it's really not that much of a stone's throw away from what they're doing on an album like Wish You, for instance. But there are moments where they pare back and they go for something more atmospheric, and that seems to be a bit contentious with people, but I personally really like it because not only does it sort of break up the potential monotony of what they're doing, but it feels really well paced within everything. Like those first 4 songs, other than just being like all of them are fucking amazing. I love the seamless transition from Crossing Guard into Slate. That's like one of my favorite musical moments of the year so far. But immediately you have a song like Divers, which just gives you some breathing room because the rest of the album is really claustrophobic and really just sort of like intense. And like, again, it's emotionally very fraught and very tense and very just kind of anxiety inducing. It puts you into a state of kind of like excited panic. It's very like, so when it does choose to mellow out, but on songs like Divers, but also on songs like Sun In, the closer, which I find like that's just a beautiful song. Like it's that makes me excited for the potential of where this band can go. Like I am desperate to hear more from these guys just because this is a properly great album, one of the best of the year so far with some of the year's best songs. And it's also something that I'm just like, I just need like, I need like 5 more records from these guys, bare minimum, because I want more of this sound.
I love the whole album. It's already, I think, currently my 4th favorite record of the year. And so I love the whole record. I think front to back, it's fantastic. I really like the moments where it gets a little bit weirder, like Sleepless, for instance, which I think is one of the eeriest and strangest and most affecting songs of the year in ways that I wasn't expecting. But that run of 4 songs, the first 4 tracks on the record, that's just another level. They hit an energy immediately and they keep it for those 4 songs. I was bowled over, especially the moment where Crossing Guard just seamlessly transitions into Slate. And that just like, because the first time I heard the album, I didn't know the song had changed.
Me
and
either.
I looked and I was like, wait, we're on a different song. And I ran it back and I felt that seamless transition again. I was like, man, these guys are like there's a well-oiled machine at work here. You know, this may be a debut album, but these are practiced and seasoned musicians who know what they're doing. And there's such a clear vision for what it is. Like we think of all these reference points. We think of the, gothic, queer, psychodrama and all the different bands and stuff that have done that. But Model Actors feel like they have a very distinct idea of what that is for them. And just the way in which these noise rocks aesthetics are completely like click into place with these very 2000s dance punk sounds, which I've been waiting for a proper,
God,
2003 era dance punk revival, like a revival of that sort of, that early Death from Above, that early LCD Sound System, those kinds of, Chick 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 and those kinds of like really nerdcore bands. I've been waiting for that stuff to get a proper revival that makes sense in the context of where music is at right now. And this album is doing that and so much more. So yeah,
it's also got moments on it, those atmospheric moments that reminded me of the last Perfume Genius album in a lot of places.
Oh, I thought of that exact comparison as well. Ugly
Right?
Season. So many different points. It reminded me of that. If you're a fan of that album, you'll definitely love this. There's definitely some shared chemistry there. All right. So having addressed those, Jake, is there anything you want to shout out as particularly standing out from your recent listens to music this week?
Well, I'll start out with the new albums that I've listened to that are new releases here, and the most notable one I'll shout out is something that we were going to cover, but we just kind of life happened and we didn't get to do an episode last week. But one of the most notable releases in the world of music recently is, of course, the newest album from pop girly Caroline Polachek. New album, Desire I Want to Turn Into You. So far, I mean, this is one of the most anticipated records of the year for a lot of people. A lot of people have been waiting for Caroline Polachek, formerly of Chairlift, to follow up her first album, Pang. And this had some really, successful singles. And I was, curious just because I liked Pang. I listened to that over the break we had in December and really enjoyed it. And it really felt like Caroline sort of coming into her own and making a lot of really good pop songs with a really definitive sound, but it felt like she was establishing her musical grammar there, and I wanted that to be elaborated upon in successive releases. And this is doing well with most people, and I hate to join the chorus. Definitively no interesting takes here from yours truly, but I really, really loved this. I think it's a pretty substantial improvement on Pang, for me, just because a lot of the appeal to Caroline is she's a great pop songwriter, but to me it was always her sound that was more enveloping, more atmospheric, and more interesting than a lot of the people that are in her stead. And I feel like this is a record that prioritizes making that sound feel as big, as wide, and as detailed as possible. And that's pretty much on display on every track here. Welcome to My Island, the intro track, is fucking fantastic. I'm also a really big fan of songs like Bunny is a Writer. The song I Believe is going on my permanent pop rotation playlist, as well as the penultimate track Smoke. Final track Billions is another big highlight for me. The only song on here that I think like dips below the pretty solidly maintained through line of the rest of the record is I'm not hugely into Crude Drawing of an Angel, but it's still buoyed by all of the fundamentally great things about this record. And I also think that the writing too is really strong here. It was strong in select moments on Pang, but on here I really do feel like conceptually Caroline is attacking the idea of just sort of where she stands in her own world in a very introspective way, of just sort of affection and sort of like not necessarily like the power dynamics of love and attraction, but I guess sort of the balancing act that one maintains and what one has to sacrifice or not sacrifice in order to have this sort of state of being that she's constantly trying to achieve, of being this object of desire on this album. And yeah, I'm pretty into this, but I know that you had a bit of a cold reaction to it, as opposed to most people.
I'm reserving final judgment. I've only heard it
Okay.
in full once, and I did struggle with it, and I've kind of been on record about this as well. It's just sort of the immediacy and the sense of talent for great hook writing. I think Caroline has demonstrated in the past, feels like it falls out of, I don't know, it just feels like it's not a focus for her here, and what she's doing is crafting something that's
I
much more
agree with that, honestly.
and that's kind of just where it left me cold. But I feel like this is a textbook, you know, initial reaction to something that could very well, once I have a full, once I spend some time with it and actually get to listen to it over and over, that I might start to really appreciate it. So
Mhm.
yeah, cold reaction for now, but I'm deliberately putting some distance between it and its hype right now before I revisit it. I do plan to, and I plan to spend more time with it in the future once the big hype cycle has died down around it. And I will, if my feelings change, I'll update. And if they don't, I won't say anything. but I like Caroline a lot. I like the first 4 songs on this. I think are fantastic, and it just kind of loses me a bit after that. But I'm keeping my permanent thoughts on ice at the moment. I'm glad to see it's doing as well as it is. It absolutely sounds like $1 million. That's undeniable.
Oh yeah,
and that's just
yeah.
it's a pleasure in and of itself to be able to spend some time in the space of a record that does have such dense attention to great sound construction and mixing and mastering and all that sort of stuff. So technically it's a marvel, and it has some really great songs on it individually, but it feels as a holistic full album a little bit like the skeleton's amazing, but I'm not feeling the meat yet. So that's me, but I digress.
Good old not feeling the meat. These next two releases I'm going to talk about are new releases, and they're from bands that I have a long history with, love both of them, and one of them is one of the best things I have heard all year. Total album of the year contender. And the other is the worst thing I've heard all year. The first one I'll talk about is an album from I've probably mentioned both of these bands in passing in past what we've been listening to segments, but they haven't put out a record in the time we've been doing the podcast, or at least not within close enough within the framework of when we've been covering newer records to have been considered for the show. So the first album I'll talk about is an album from the progressive rock, progressive metal band Riverside. And Morgan and I are both huge fans of this band. And honestly, their output from their debut 2003's Out of Myself through 2015's Love, Fear, and the Time Machine is fucking outstanding. If you are a prog nerd and you haven't heard of these guys or just haven't checked them out until now, if you like bands very specifically that sort of 90s prog rock revival, bands like Porcupine Tree and bands like Dream Theater, this band needs to be on your radar. Specifically albums like Out of Myself, Second Life Syndrome, Anno Domini, High Definition. All of these are really great, deeply atmospheric ventures of progressive rock and progressive metal. Tool is another basis for comparison that a lot of people bring up often. And 2015's Love, Fear, and the Time Machine was my introduction to them, which is them venturing into a more psychedelic rock oriented sound. And honestly, I think that record's deeply underrated. I love that album. And they kind of have a reverse Porcupine Tree progression, is that they start out kind of harder prog metal and prog rock, and then they venture into a more psychedelic space. But I did kind of have a bit of a lukewarm reaction to their 2018 album Wasteland. That was a record that was just, it very much felt wheel spinny. It very much felt like them playing it safe, and just it was a very drab, kind of lethargic incarnation of their sound that I did not get a whole lot out of, which is a shame, because this band, again, that run from 2003 to 2015, that's 6 albums that are all fucking great. Bare minimum, that's the lowest rating I'd give an album there is a 7.5 out of 10, and it's as good as most of this run of records would be up there with Porcupine Tree's run, for instance. That's the level we're talking about here. So I was obviously interested when they came out with a new record, which is bafflingly called Identity, but it's ID.Entity, which this band does not have a history of titling some of their songs great, so that was kind of par for course. There's a song on Love, Fear, and the Time Machine called #Addicted. It's a great song, but woof. I remember being very wary of that when it came out. But this album dropped and it seemed to be getting some decent reception. And so I looked at it and I was like, oh, this is a double album. It's 80 minutes long. And that's not technically true. Rate Your Music just has the bass track list as it's a deluxe edition that was released. It's sort of following in that trend of Devin Townsend, for instance, where it's the core album is the first thing, and then the second disc is the deluxe edition, but it's all new material. And to be frank, I couldn't listen past the first disc because I hated this so much that I couldn't bring myself to do it. this is this is fucking terrible. And in a way that really caught me off guard, just because even though their last record I wasn't a big fan of, it's just like, you're more than willing to give a band you love, especially when they're on a hot streak, one or two misfires is fine. Like that's, everybody's got their The Incident, like when an album that just sort of falls lower on the gradient of scale of quality. And even after adjusting my expectations a little bit, like maybe that, maybe they weren't ever going to get to the heights of their original run again. But even adjusting for expectations, this is dire shit. And the thing is, it's because of a lot of different things. First of all, the sound they're going for on this album. They're really trying to attempt basically sounding like 80s Rush. They're going for making their equivalent of like the Power Windows, or like the not quite the full-on synth wavy stuff, like not quite to something like Signals, but like that transitional period where it was a solid blend of their original prog rock stuff, Permanent Waves, that kind of stuff. And if you know us, you'll know that we love those albums. I adore those records. Big ups for that era of Rush. And the problem here is that they go for that sound, but it is colorless. It's so drab. The mixing here is so flat. There's no vibrancy to these synth tones, and they are everywhere. And it's just lathered in this kind of slop that just renders all of the instrumental proficiency that this band have. That's just like it just removes any sense. Like if there's a guitar solo, it's just like, okay, it's impressive, but it doesn't sound good. And that's a big problem. And a lot of it too is that a lot of these songs are so long. And not to mention, this band is just at their least dynamic. This is like the least progressive album I've heard from a progressive band in some time. I mean, it's makes fucking Fear Inoculum look like Francis the Mute. It's just like the progressions here aren't progressions. They're just repetitions of the same idea over and over again. And the worst part is the lyrics. I'd like to feel like we have some tolerance for stuff like this, is that, prog bands are not necessarily known for their subtlety. They're not exactly known for approaching their topics with a lot of tact. And, that has its limitations. Look no further than the most recent Steven Wilson solo album that we all universally did not care for, which this reminded me heavily of in many places, except it's just not as solidly constructed of an album as that, which, yikes. And a lot of this album is, to be frank about it, it's very Ayn Randy. This whole album is like, it's so, like, there's a part where he complains about being online with the screens, and about the genders and how there's too many of them, about how, like, it's all of this shit that's just like every lyric you hear, you're just like, oh, really, man? You're one of those, huh? And it's the whole out. Like, there's a song on this album, I shit you not, called Big Tech Brother. Big Brother, like
But
1984, but it's big tech.
like,
And
because AI and
because
surveillance and
it
the nanny state.
it's there's the whole, like, the place where I belong is 13 minutes of pseudo Randian horse shit. It's that and Big Tech Brother are honestly the two worst songs I've heard this year. Most, like, Place Where I Belong, truly the nadir of this record being a whopping 13 minutes long, and it's horse shit all the way through, and it just sounds bad. It's all sludge. There's just, when you get right down to it, there's just nothing likable about this album. Like, there's no singular element where I'm just like, oh yeah, I'm kind of into that. Like, there's just nothing here. And the drop off from their other records is just like, you know, even like the singing on here is a bit kind of washed. I would describe the vocal presence on here as it's like the perfect synthesis of the clean vocals of Steven Wilson and Mikael Ackerfeldt. It's right in between them on the gradient, and it's just kind of it's produced so flatly that it just sounds like, it actually sounds like the collaboration album between Mikael Ackerfeldt and Steven Wilson, Storm Corrosion, which notoriously I think is mid as fuck because it's boring as shit. And every couple of years I try to go back to it and listen to it, and I am always disappointed by how cold it leaves me. And this is like that, but it's written by a 13-year-old who just read Atlas Shrugged. And the fact that this had 40 more minutes of material on it, I was just like, no, I refuse. It's not even the kind of bad that I feel like you need to, like, you have to listen to it to believe it. Like, just go listen to their good albums. I promise that they're worthwhile. But my God, this was, I cannot remember the last time I was this disappointed in an album. Like, this was worse than the second part of that Smashing Pumpkins record that came out so far this year. And frankly, it would be impressive if they get me to hate the third part of it more than I did this. So to counteract that, by process of elimination, you'll know that what I'm going to talk about next is one of the best things I've heard this year. And this is from the melodic death metal and progressive metal band Insomnium. I've mentioned them way long ago. They're one of the first big, heavy, extreme metal bands I ever got into, sort of my own accord, of my own volition, because they had some big albums that came out in 2016 and 2017, which was sort of the year I got into big acclaimed releases. I think of them and another band like Moon Sorrow in very much the same respect. They're both very melodic, progressive death metal bands that have like just faultless catalogs of music. Like, Insomnium are a band that, like, they were like Riverside up until Riverside decided to suck. Is that ever since they started making music, they've been great. I think that any like mellow death fan is going to tell you that bands like Above the Weeping World, or albums like Above the Weeping World, are absolutely fucking essential. I know Morgan, for instance, also additionally loves that album, but there's also Across the Dark, Shadows of the Dying Sun, terrific albums. And most recently, their album in 2019, Heart Like a Grave, was an interesting pivot for them because it incorporated a lot more electronic stuff than this band have ever utilized. And I'd say that that's probably the weakest album that they've released, but I still really enjoyed it. It was a big risk for them. It was something that not everybody liked, but pretty much I think uniformly was agreed to be a tasteful release, if nothing else. Everybody was into it. So I love this band. I love their catalog. And again, if you're into the cleaner side of death metal, it's very progressive. It's very ambitious, but it's got that impact. It's got the riffs. It's got, everything fundamentally about this band is exceptional. And then there have been a couple singles released for their newest album, Anno 1696. A collaboration with the metal musician Sakis Tolis. One of the singles was with him as like a featured vocalist, and so I know a lot of people were excited about that. He's a member of the band Rotting Christ, and they have like they're a big band in this scene. And they also do with featured vocalist on another one of the singles, Johanna Kukela, who is big in her respective ventures of music. And yeah, this thing kicks ass. I had to go back and listen to what I previously considered to be this band's best album, that being Winter's Gate. That album and Above the Weeping World are sort of the high points of this band for me. and I really enjoy them. And Winter's Gate is this huge fucking 6-part, but like still single piece of music that's like this really ambitious. A lot of storytelling goes on in a lot of these albums. And that was that was the album that got me into them. And yeah, I narrowly think this is their best album. I think it's better than that. It just has so many moments on here that made you that face that I specifically make when I hear metal music that just makes me go, oh, oh man, that's the shit. Like from the title track alone, this is 100% worth hearing. I actually, there are moments on here that don't hit the astronomical heights of stuff like, again, 1696, the third track with Johanna Kukela, Godforsaken, which is indescribably fantastic. Her very operatic vocal presence on here is just mwah, it's fucking beautiful. And then the highlight of this year in metal music so far, the incomparable Starless Paths, and the also similarly fantastic The Witch Hunter. All of these songs are packed to the brim with interesting aspects of storytelling, great hooks, amazing melodies, and everything just fucking hits. This is exactly what you want from a melodic progressive death metal release. Again, this is often a band that gets comparisons to stuff like Opeth. If you have been missing the heavier side of Opeth recently, this is going to fill that niche very, very comfortably. There are moments like the penultimate track, The Unrest, which is on the softer side, and I'm actually not hugely into the Sakis Tolis feature just because I feel like the harshness of his vocal presence, and it's just a bit of a clash with the aesthetic of the rest of this, which is very pristine, and it's a bit of an acquired taste, this kind of metal. And I know that a lot of death metal fans are like, if it doesn't sound the nastiest, ugliest thing in the world, then it sucks, it's bad. But as somebody who enjoys all facets of death metal, this hit all the right spots. It was exactly what I needed. Fundamentally solid from every respect. Very much, if you liked albums I've recommended in the past, like last year's Moon of Foul Magics, for instance, but if you found the production on that to be a little bit harsh, if the black metal influences on that sort of held you at a distance, on here, it's crystalline. This is easily going to stand among the best metal albums of the year for me. So check this out if it sounds interesting.
As for what I've been listening to this week, I'll keep it brief. Again, some new releases I want to shout out that we didn't have a chance to review or talk about sooner. I'll shout out, there's a new solo album from Avey Tare of Animal Collective called 7S. We talked about the Animal Collective quote-unquote comeback album.
Sevens.
We didn't actually formally review Time Skiffs, the comeback album, but we've talked about it on the show, and we've been very positive towards it. It's a great album. We did review the Panda Bear solo album with Pete Kember / Sonic Boom of Spaceman 3 that they put out last year, Reset, which is still, I think, a great album. One of my favorite in the large, expansive canon of Animal Collective solo records. I think that album still holds up really well. It's one of my many rotational albums for when I just need something chill to have on while I'm working. But I was really intrigued by the new Avey Tare solo album, because I like the singles that came out. It shows Avey in a much more exploratory and sort of slower paced space than he's ever been before. It's a direction he's kind of been heading with his solo work. And here's the thing, right? Avey Tare, front man of Animal Collective. I know that Avey and Panda are kind of like co-front men, but Avey is the guy, more so than Panda. So I have always kind of found it a little bit frustrating that I've struggled a bit with Avey's solo material. I think that each solo album he's put out has bright spots. But it wasn't really until 2019's amusingly titled Cows on Hourglass Pond that I started to think, okay, there's a bit of I think what Avey's inclinations are starting to coalesce into music that's feeling a little bit more substantive. Like, I can't tell you about the wrecked periods of disappointment and trying to convince myself that Slasher Flicks, the side project he did with Angel Deridorian of Dirty Projectors in 2015, was actually a great album. It's not. It should be, but it isn't. So anyway, That's all to say. I've been wanting Avey to be able to find and settle into a groove with the solo material where I can just be completely on board with it. And I'm pleased to say that's absolutely happened. I mean, it happened with Cows on Hourglass Pond, but it's even truer of this new album, 7S, which is definitely his best solo record yet. It is immaculate sound design, immaculate from a perspective of just setting you into this musical pool, essentially. It's everything you would want. Very languorous, slow-paced, beautiful tracks, but with really varied and exciting instrumentation as well. Like, obviously it's psychedelic pop. It's very much what you would expect as well, but it goes to some interesting places. It has some surprises, some left turns in the back half as well, and tracks that you might not be expecting. And Avey throughout, just he has enough core genuinely great melodies to make the whole thing feel memorable, but also it has this sense of being awash in this massively expansive soundscape that makes it feel completely enveloping and like a true sort of album experience. I think it's fantastic. I've only listened to it twice, but the second time I liked it even more than the first time. So it's going to be on rotation for me throughout the year. I would say, regardless of how much Animal Collective solo material I've listened to, this is a really good one worth checking out, I think. It doesn't have any baggage attached to it. It's just a really solid, very beautiful, but also quirky and idiosyncratic solo record from Avey that I highly recommend. On the more disappointing side of the spectrum, a new album from Orbital came out this year, Optical Delusion. Now, look, I didn't have high expectations for this.
Or like horrible tool. That was the best I had.
If you try and don't succeed, the lesson is never try.
Hear that, Orbital? Don't try anymore. Fuck you.
But look, Orbital, one of my favorite acts of all time. I mean,
we've talked about them on the show.
We did a classic Record Club review of their incredible acid house IDM classic Inside, which is one of my favorite albums of all time, a perfect 10 for me. I love a lot of Orbital's work. They are fundamentally inconsistent because they're kind of a goofy proposition, and they have cheesy and slightly tasteless tendencies they always have had in their music, and that's kind of part of the appeal of them for me. Like, Orbital are never going to be, and have never wanted to be, and have never really tried to be, this kind of like pure, dedicated to artistry and seriousness that some of the more austere IDM acts like Square Pusher and Aphex Twin you might associate them with. I guess Aphex Twin is more playful. I mean, I guess Square Pusher and Music or whatever. Orbital have always had this childish sort of streak that has run through their music as well, and there's always been a bit of a political element in some of their music as well, and often it's kind of a bit hokey and not very nuanced in its expression, but it's always been there, and it's never been something that I've held against them. Their previous album, 2017's Monsters Exist, was not a good album. It was it was very disappointing, especially because 2012's Wonky, which was actually the first album they released after a reunion because they were broken up for 8 years. That album was fantastic. And that album, I think, is definitely an album I would push people to listen to if they're new to Orbital and want to hear something that gives you an idea of what Orbital are like, but with a real modern sheen that doesn't sound like the 90s. Listen to Wonky. It's incredibly sharply produced. It's loads of fun. There's like actual EDM and even like dubstep influence from the era kind of integrated into that record, but they managed to do it really well and just make it sound really exciting and fun. There's great melodies. There's great music. I always, whenever I get a chance, recommend the album Wonky to people who are new to Orbital, because that is just such a great entry point into what they do. It's like a greatest hits of new material that's been completely remastered for the 2010s. So when they came back from their breakup with that album, I had no reason to believe that they were going to be anything but laser focused with their subsequent work. Then Monsters Exist came out and it sucked. It's a bad album. It's annoying. It doesn't sound good. It feels like, not only does it feel like Orbital on autopilot, but it feels like they kind of forget how to do those basic things that make the idea of Orbital on autopilot sound even acceptable. There's like one properly good song on that album, and the rest is just kind of forgettable and at times utterly regrettable, especially the spoken word closing track with Brian Cox, the physicist, astrophysicist Brian Cox, not the actor, who
I was gonna say, I was like, you gotta try really hard to make that suck.
no, but the astrophysicist, popular astrophysicist Brian Cox gives a lecture about how we're all made of stardust, and all that kind of like hokey, life and
Yeah,
death are.
spoken word closing track is not a series of words I like to hear put together.
So, Monsters Exist was a complete letdown. I don't like that album. And I was hoping that, given the low bar that album kind of put them at, that Optical Delusion, their new record, would be able to surpass it. And it does barely. And maybe it doesn't even. It's so close in terms of quality with that it might not even really matter. This is a disappointing album. It feels like, there are certain points where they get that Orbital on autopilot a little bit more right than they did on Monsters Exist. But the trade-off for that is that the worst parts of this album are even worse than the worst parts of Monsters Exist. The opening track on this new album is called Orbital Ringer Ringer, parentheses, the old pandemic folk song. And let me tell you what this song is. Forgive me. What this song is it is an interpolation of the famous nursery rhyme Ringer Ringer Rosies. Like the chorus is that Ringer Ringer Rosies, a pocket full of posies. And the joke is COVID-19, because that, of course, was written about the Black Death, that famous nursery rhyme. And here it's being repurposed because, there's
did they really think somebody was going to listen to that and be like,
the thing is,
whoa,
that particular kind of corny shtick is actually par for the course for Orbital, and they've done stuff like that before, but there's always been something a little bit more muscular, or there's always been something a little bit more tongue-in-cheek about it that makes it work. Whereas I don't get anything from this execution of it. It just feels very lame. And
we're getting IDM songs about COVID. Can we just stop now, guys? Like, this is the point we've reached.
There's songs on here called The New Abnormal and Are You Alive? And those are the best songs on the album, by the way. There's the absolute abomination, You Are the Frequency, which is, Orbital have definitely put out some bad songs in the past. This might be the worst song they've ever released. It is atrocious. Just absolutely terrible. There's a song called Dirty Rat with Sleaford Mods in the back half. And if the idea of the guy from Sleaford Mods doing his, like fast sung quasi rap, thing, post-punky thing over top of an Orbital instrumental didn't make you immediately want to leap from a fifth floor window, then listening to the actual song itself it is a complete embarrassment. And yeah, the album just never finds momentum to lose. It just completely is flat from that opening track. And yeah, hey, look, there's 3 songs on there that I think are baseline. You've got something here. And it's just like a cool basic idea from a musical standpoint that nothing is done with it.
A 5 out of 10 EP within a 3 out of 10 album.
Yeah, basically. So it's a huge disappointment. I don't want to write off Orbital completely again, because I feel like when they really sharpen what they're good at, they can make records like Wonky, and they've come back from absolute crushing lows before. Like 2001's The Altogether was a record I was considering at one point for an upcoming discussion of terrible albums by great bands, and they bounced back from that fairly well. But yeah, it's rough going for Orbital right now, and I don't know how to be optimistic about the problem.
Please stop hurting me.
Yeah. The last thing I'll shout out is that I listened to a new release that was getting a surprising amount of hype. We briefly alluded to, I think, possibly reviewing this a couple of weeks ago. And then, of course, we weren't able to record last weekend. So the idea of it, of course, went out the window. But I finally got around to listening to the new Skrillex album, Quest for Fire.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, the first of 2 albums that he's put out this month, although the second one appears to be a little bit more of a return to his bro step roots that people are not quite enjoying.
Yeah, I was gonna say people. The reception to these two albums has been so funny because everybody's like, "Oh, this first one's pretty good," and the second one is just like
Well,
everyone's
yeah.
just like, "This fucking sucks."
Well, I haven't heard the second one, but I think what I can gather that they are very deliberately like two very different albums. But anyway, as for Quest for Fire, this is the one everyone's been raving about. Look, I say this as someone who had actually fairly strong expectations given the reception, and this pretty much lived up to them. Like, this is as good as I expected it to be, if not a little bit better. It has a lot of vibrancy. It feels very modern. It's a great showcase for what a good producer Skrillex actually is. And when I say good as well, I mean, it's hard to use words like good and bad when you talk about someone whose canonical, most popular work is as deliberately tasteless and below the line as what Skrillex's most famous music is. And you can debate all day how well songs like Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites and Bangarang hold up. I think it's an era of musical history that is ripe for re-examination, and I think we have enough distance from it now to look back at it and ask interesting questions about it and appreciate a lot of that music for what it was. It certainly was music that I think from the tastemakers was overhated to a certain extent, or at least like talked about in these kind of very dismissive ways that feel like they were kind of not even open to the possibility of examining the music for what it was. But anyway, I think what I like about this is that Skrillex could absolutely come forward with another slice of that kind of music he was doing back then. And maybe that's what the second album, Don't Get Too Close, is. But this is just, the point of this is to showcase what a varied talent as a producer Skrillex is, like how good he is at manifesting EDM in a lot of different formats and incorporating a lot of influences from the world of EDM that spawned from him, and of course that existed before he came around as well. And so, I mean, this is nowhere is this more further exemplified than the fact that the closing track here is a collaboration with Porter Robinson. And he's an artist I thought of a few times while listening to this. It's a very hyperactive, and, you certainly are not going to mistake it. There's moments on here where you're like, oh yeah, this is definitely Skrillex. Like on the opening track, Leave Me Like This, which is one of the highlights of the record. There is this one moment where, as it kind of builds to its, I don't hesitate to use the D word, but it does build to this moment where everything kind of explodes. And he does that little,
David Duchovny.
He does that little, he throws in that little "oh my god" sample from from Scary Monsters, and it's like a deliberate sort of tongue-in-cheek like throwback, because he does a snippet of it and then he just kind of rips it away. And but no, it's a really good album, like just genuinely really good. It sounds immaculate. There's those extroverted silly moments, but there's also lots of moments of just great bouncy melodies. The thing that really pulls this through, though, above and beyond just being like a cool mix of beats that Skrillex has been working on, is the fact that features are very thoroughly and very tastefully deployed on this album as well. And Missy Elliott and Mr. Owazo, two artists I could never imagine on the same song together, even though their whole deal does feel like they both have this sort of bizarro out there energy that does mean they kind of work together. That's a highlight moment. There's a track with Tare and Fortet that just sounds like a modern Fortet song, but with a lot more animation, a lot more groove, a lot more vibrancy. I kind of wish that song that Fortet's on here, Butterflies, I kind of wish that his modern, like his more recent stuff, which I haven't been into, sounded more like this, to be honest. It's kind of crazy that Skrillex is doing Fortet better than Fortet is.
Skrillex made a better album than Orbital.
Well, absolutely. No question. Just continually throughout this, I found the beats and the instrumentals to be very charming, frequently kind of a little bit stupid, but not in a way that felt like it was going too far into the red or anything like this. It's just a really entertaining album. I think that if you've enjoyed any kind of EDM music in the last 10 years, whether it be Porter Robinson or whether it be someone a little bit more out there, intense, bizarre, whatever, I think the great thing about Quest for Fire is that it feels like it collects and cultivates and brings together a lot of different modern traditions of electronic dance music, while shedding some of the things that feel the most hokey and lame about what it can be, right? So there's no like Black Eyed Peas or David Guetta or any of that kind of shitty stuff that's been kind of weirdly resurfacing on Twitter as of late. It just feels very modern, it feels very slick, and it feels very well crafted. So I thoroughly enjoy it and I absolutely recommend it. It's lightweight, right? It's not, it's not going to be no one's album of the year, but I just had a really great time listening to it. I would listen to it again happily. It's 45 minutes. It's really tight. It's really fun. And it never for a moment pretends it's anything more or less than what it is. And that is the highest of compliments for a Skrillex album from me. Okay, well, let's finally get into our main topic of discussion today, which is bad albums from great artists. Now, I set out some vague criteria here because I thought, well, this is a proposition you can read in a number of different ways. And I think it's more interesting if we kind of try and highlight the most interesting examples. So, for instance, no debut albums, because, any band can be a bit rough around the edges when they start out. I also said, let's avoid bad albums that are a part of like a long streak of decline for the artist as well. Like they may be an artist that's, past their peak or whatever, but the record has to be particularly bad even for them, right? So it can't just be like, like I briefly considered a 90s era Iron Maiden album. And then I'm like, no, I mean, there's just too many of those, unfortunately.
It would be like picking Saint Anger.
Yeah. Well, that was the other thing, as I said, another criteria is let's avoid artists that we have talked about extensively before as well. Let's keep it fresh. Let's bring to the table interesting albums that make you kind of ask what went wrong and ask it in a way that we haven't asked on this show before. Because I think that's a really interesting question to ask about a great artist that you love when they just completely miss the mark, like fundamentally. And again, the artist has to have made great records before that. So it's just an interesting question to ask what went wrong, and we're going to kind of try and hypothesize, talk a little bit about it with each of our 3 picks. So Jake, why don't you lead off with your first pick for bad albums, even terrible albums from great artists?
Well, my first pick here is from a band, I suppose more it's from the musical mind that participated in many different bands over the years that I have to say I am reluctantly a fan of, just because a lot of what this music signifies and a lot of its fans are, to be blunt, very obnoxious people. But I nonetheless find myself very driven towards the music of one Mr. Maynard James Keenan. And one of his projects that we've talked about Tool in the past, but one project of his we haven't really touched on is his other, certainly most well-known band other than Tool, which is A Perfect Circle. And A Perfect Circle were, they kind of had their moment in the sun, especially because Tool kind of petered out for a little while in terms of popularity, and they just had, a big gap in their releases. But what kind of tided people over was the fact that in 2000, A Perfect Circle released their album Mère de Noms, which is a very beloved record, one that people like a whole lot. It's got singles on it like Judith that are, like really essential to that sort of phase that alt rock was in. And it sort of blends metal, alternative rock, and it's a bit more palatable, I think, a little bit more radio ready than something like Tool, but it still doesn't abandon the core things that make someone like Maynard James Keenan an interesting artist, and also doesn't abandon the things that can kind of make him a little bit more cringeworthy on the lyrical side of things. And nowhere is that better exemplified than in their third album, which is my pick for my first choice here, 2004's Emotive.
Can I just say off the bat, I love, I think A Perfect Circle, and I've grown, because when I was a teenager, I was that super hipster dude who was like, oh, Tool, or the poor man's Mars Volta or whatever. I was just like completely, and I had this association with The Perfect Circle as well. I've grown out of that. I mean, I'm willing to say now Tool are a fantastic band, and
yeah, they are,
that make great records. And I think A Perfect Circle, I've heard some of those early singles as well. Judith, 3 Libras, is that the other song on that album?
Yeah.
Great songs. But I'll be honest, the only Perfect Circle album I've heard in full is Emotive. So I'm curious. I'm curious. I want to hear, first of all, because I know this album not well. I've just heard it as a child. what makes this album such a massive step off the deep end compared to the first two?
After Mare de Noms, which was a very well-received album, 2003's 13th Step is another album that is similarly beloved. In fact, I think you would probably see a lot of fans of Tool in a Perfect Circle argue that 13th Step is their best album. I go back and forth personally, but I really enjoy both of these records. Not to the point where I would say I love either, think either is a masterpiece, but they certainly withhold a solid level of just like all are pretty tightly put together, and all of them retain that sort of appeal that's, easier to listen to. Tool, harder edged alt rock. It's certainly a lot, again, edgier than anything that was sort of competing with it at the time. And 2004, the year after 13th Step, is just like, it's kind of strange that they would put out a record so soon after that. And that does have to do a little bit with the origins of Emotive. And 2004, take yourself back to this time for a little bit, and you'll remember that, or if you were alive at least, you'll remember that
7.
a trend, as was I, at the time though, it became a bit of a popular trend kickstarted by this little band called Green Day that sort of made it okay to do one thing. And that one thing was shit on George W. Bush, which was funny because when the Iraq War began, that was a taboo because America was so patriotic, and the pro-war right was the majority in America. And you had bands like the Dixie Chicks who said they were ashamed that the president was from Texas, and that ruined their career. Like, people were like, if you aligned yourself with that politically, you were done. Like, people would do the whole like Beatles getting their records burned shit, but for the modern day. And then Green Day came out with American Idiot at the sort of turn of the first term of his presidency. And by then, everybody was so worn out with the Iraq War that sentiment became more and more popular. And then not only did that sentiment become more popular, it kind of became a trend, and more people hopped on this bandwagon, and A Perfect Circle hopped on that bandwagon. And what Emotive is a series of, I think mostly, I don't know how many, is there an original song on
Yeah,
this
I mean, the
album?
biggest single
Okay.
from this album, Counting Bodies Like Sheep,
Yeah,
was the original.
I'll get to that. But for the most part, this is an album consisting of covers that are traditionally associated with like vaguely anti-war ideas, and they are done in the style of A Perfect Circle's harder edged alt rock. And let me just say, again, I'm not exactly spitting any hot takes here because this is notoriously seen as a bad album, but I think that it's sort of been lost to time just because this is a sect and era of music that's just not in people's gaze. That this isn't something that again, it's rock music in the strictest sense of the word, so it's not exactly something that a ton of people are willing to look back on or reevaluate in a modern context. But the notion of covering songs like John Lennon's Imagine, covering songs like
truly a crazy moment in nu metal history.
I mean, that is certainly true. Also covering What's Going On. Yes, that song is covered here. But also I will say the one thing on here that I think is redeemable is the cover of When the Levee Breaks. I think that comparatively speaking, that is way more in line with what A Perfect Circle do, and tradition, like just the way they pull it off is agreeable to some extent. But you also have, Peace, Love, and Understanding. You have the song Annihilation, which is just fucking awful on here, by the way. Annihilation,
Sorry.
What's Going On, and Gimme 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 are 3 all-time low points for the artistic canon of Maynard James Keenan. But
You
I
get
have to say,
hang on, I just want to say real quick, you get a back-to-back, just because this means something to me personally, because I was a fan of these bands as a kid, and it was part of the reason why I was attracted to listening to this album in full. The back-to-back covers of Depeche Mode's People Are People and Devo's Freedom of Choice are astoundingly ill-advised.
terrible. I mean, like this is not only like just genres and worlds of music that just are completely outside of this band's sort of like, you know, batting average, so to speak, but you have the original song on here, which is amazingly titled "Counting Bodies Like Sheep to the Rhythm of War Drums." And I'm gonna be real with you. I think this is the cringiest shit that Maynard James Keenan's name has ever been on. Especially if you have not seen the music video
I've
to
seen
this
it, baby.
song, you like seriously pause, minimize the tab that you're like listening to this in. I need you to go and watch this because it looks like it was made in MS Paint. It looks like it was animated using Flash. It's literally doing the everyone's asleep and you have to wake up, and the imagery of just the actual like the literal usage and evocation of actual sheep in the music video is amazing.
Speaking of 2004, there is literally more subtlety in the Bush satire here in Team America World Police than there is on this song and album. That is a more nuanced and thoughtful and subtle examination of Iraq War era Bush and his politics than anything that Maynard
I
James
would
Keenan has
say
ever written.
this is maybe this part of this wave of music at its absolute least subtle. And not to mention, it's like you don't have to be subtle to be effective, but what this whole album, this album, what makes it like truly terrible in my eyes is that it's not just a bad, ill-advised set of covers where they're just overreaching their bounds as a band and creatively, and like, not to mention this band, like this was rushed out in the span of a year. This album does not sound very good, like at all. You listen to 13th Step, which is an album that sounds fucking amazing, and then you listen to this and it's like, I can tell that maybe the studio didn't exactly it wasn't exactly utilized to its fullest potential on here, but the colossal arrogance that just emanates from this album, that's just like wafting like a prolonged fart from this whole thing. It's just everyone making this was so far up their own asses. Everyone, like every lyric of the original song here, it reeks of the most repugnant kind of like, just because you agree with someone's politics does not mean you are on the same page as them, and expressing it creatively can land you on any side of like whether or not you're going to be successful creatively in your particular endeavor here. But this is absolutely goes so far into what it is that it renders any potential incisiveness that it has completely fucking dulled, and as a result is just it's just a big old nothing of a record, and it's only notable for how cringe it is.
I had this song on my first MP3 player, which was like a 256 megabyte thing that had like enough room for like 50 songs, and this was one of them. And the version of this song I had was taken from like, I don't know if you were doing this far back enough to remember, but if you wanted to rip a song from YouTube, like back in those days, like the websites you had to use were just, they were caveman technology, and they were just so like, you usually would have to actually download the video, and usually you'd get a 360p file, and then you'd have to use a second program or a second website
extract it from that,
and then you like, and whatever I used ended up like, because I of course was ripping the music video, and I ended up with like a permanent metadata thumbnail of the music video as the art for the song.
Oh no.
And I listened to that shit. I was a big fan. I will say there is one other original on the album, Passive, which I think is a great song.
Yeah, that one's okay. That one's okay.
A pretty strong song. And I do want to go back and listen to the actually great Perfect Circle records as well, because I feel like with the passage of time and with how much patience I have for some of the alt metal from that area is a little bit on the more tasteless side. I think I'll probably really get a lot out of that. And I'm just, again, scanning through ratings and stuff, and I see that you have Eat the Elephant at 3 stars as well. Would it be fair to say that's an underrated album? Because people seem to have shit on that pretty hard when it came out too. So
I like it.
Yeah. It's some more love for A Perfect Circle, just not for a motive. My first pick today is, oh boy, okay. So this one hurts. I'm going to kind of go in ascending order of profile, or I guess of like how well people will know these records. And I'm going to start with one that I try so hard every time I think about this band, one of my favorite bands of all time. I try so hard to memory hold the existence of this album, especially because it spoils, one of the greatest, a short run, to be fair, but a great run of some of the most essential indie rock that's ever been made. And of course, I'm talking about the Dismemberment Plan, who have made 2 of my favorite albums of all time, Emergency and I, of course, which is in my top 10 of all time, and Change, which is, one of the most devastating albums I've ever heard. And, and of course, Dismemberment Plan is Terrified as well. The album before Emergency and I is fantastic, and their debut, ! Is underrated too. So a great run of very smart, very fun, very funny as well, humorous and incisive, and often quietly heartbreaking albums from a band that are so full of energy, so full of verve, so full of just ridiculously dizzying displays of musical proficiency that you could hardly imagine a better run. And for a while, no one had to. They dropped off with Change. I mean, they finished off with Change. That was the last album they put out. They broke up shortly afterwards. Travis Morrison, frontman of Dismemberment Plan, quite infamously had a solo album, Travistan, that was received so poorly that it essentially destroyed his musical career. Famously got one of the most notorious 0.0 reviews from Pitchfork ever. And it was like one of those examples of one of those very blog era examples of that point in time in the mid 2000s when like Pitchfork actually had the power to literally kill a career or make a career. Like, people forget that Pitchfork are the reason Arcade Fire became popular because of their funeral review. But anyway, I digress. Dismemberment Plan broke up, and then Travis Morrison's solo career completely pancaked from day one. But eventually they decided to get back together, and in 2014 they released Uncanny Valley, which is an album that is certainly credited to the band, The Dismemberment Plan. Look, I mean, there's no getting around it. It's definitely, you listen to it. Yeah, it's the Dismemberment Plan, or at the very least, it is Travis Morrison. I mean, it is the Dismemberment Plan in reality. Like, it is all the members of that band, full reunion. They're all playing on the album. And there's half asleep for it in the best of moments, and in the worst of moments, they are completely anonymous. Look, I actually think that musically, there's a good stretch of this record, like in the middle and the last song, that is acceptable, passable. And this is me definitely being generous because of how much I love this band. I think Invisible is a pretty good song. But the thing that really completely ruins this, and this is why it had to go in this, it was made for this particular segment, is because it's the thing that ruins this, is the thing that makes Emergency and I a top 10 album of all time for me. And that's Travis Morrison's lyricism. Travis Morrison, as a writer on Emergency and I, on Is Terrified, and on Change, on those 3 albums, one of the greatest writers of all time, in my opinion. Music, in the world of music anyway. The final verse on Back and Forth is my favorite lyrical passage ever.
I listened to Emergency and I this morning, and I was still like, oh my God, Life of Possibilities is still one of the best written songs I've ever heard.
Every line on that album is poetry, and it feels like the definitive statement on all of the feelings of isolation and anxiety that, has ever been expressed. And Travis Morrison's lyricism on this album is atrocious. It is appalling. how bad it is. The most polite thing and the kindest thing I can say is that this is deliberately irreverent. It is absolutely a record where no one involved is trying to make something serious in any way, shape, or form. It is a bunch of guys. They're all dads now. Before they were dads, they were in a pretty cool band that a lot of people liked, but they broke up and they had families and their lives went on. They decided to get back together in one of the dad's garages, while the kids are at school or whatever, jam for a little bit and make an album. And it is asinine at best. It is songs like White Collar, White Trash, songs like Daddy Was a Real Good Dancer, songs like Mexico City Christmas, songs like the utterly unlistenable Go and Get It, which is truly like a Corey Feldman tier song. That song is just I hate listening to it. And the whole time Travis Morrison is completely pancaking it. Like, he's taking the kind of irreverence and silliness that he was able to use to make quite potent points about, anxiety in the technological era on those early records. And they are resulting in lines like, you hit the space bar enough and cocaine comes out. I really like this computer. That's the opening line of the album. I'm a fat man on drugs, drowning in hugs. You know that I love the lovin' because of something some people saw what they saw and now no one's saying nothing. It's I mean, I genuinely think that, you hit the space bar enough and cocaine comes out. I really like this computer. It might be the worst opening line of any album I've ever heard. It's just atrocious. And yeah, the album fails in the most disappointing of ways. I'm not saying that every time Travis Morrison opens his mouth, it has to be the most profound thing you've ever heard. Songs like, plenty of songs like, Girl O'Clock, Gyroscope, some of the more irreverent moments on those classic records are very silly and are just pure expressions of an unfettered id at its most chaotic. And it feels like the worst thing I can say about this is it feels like Travis Morrison is trying to capture that, but it feels like so contrived. Like, it is a contrived attempt at being funny. And it feels like it feels like you're at a party and some dude you've always hated has decided to start doing a stand-up set in the middle of the living room and no one is listening, and he is just flaring and flaming and completely riffing in the most unbearable way possible. Yeah, it's an atrocious album, and we pretend we do not see it. I just don't know why this exists. I don't know why you come back together and decide that it's worth it to release this. It makes no sense to me at all. Jake, what's your second pick?
Well, I talked about my affinity for this artist recently on the show, and I don't even really know what led me to listen to this originally, but for some reason it was one of the first albums I ever heard from him, and that is Elton John's Victim of Love. This album came out in 1979, which, that's a little past his, like, the true blue bona fide golden run of albums he had. Like, he had some albums in between this and his last properly great record, Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy. But, nothing horrible. Like, at worst, I think you could call the worst album in that bunch agreeable. So naturally, that's the thing, is that even though those records aren't horrible, he had a lot of diminishing commercial appeal. Like, his hits were kind of behind him at this point. And, he's trying to grasp onto a bit of relevancy, maybe try to hop onto a trend, just because even though he made those records, like, those were big, expensive albums, and the amount of singles that they had was sort of like getting fewer and fewer. So naturally, what he decided to do was make a disco album in 1979. And I think one of the most telling things about Victim of Love is that this album is 35 minutes long, It's 7 tracks. You can just kind of tell from the outset that Elton maybe wasn't putting his best foot forward. He's a guy who really loves his big albums, his big conceptual shit. He has all of these records that are filled with stories and, different sounds and genres, but this is just straight up disco. There's nothing else that this album is really trying to do. And like my last pick, it actually, one of its most notable moments is a cover. The intro being a cover of Chuck Berry's Johnny Be Good. Which
an 8-minute disco cover of one of the most classic rock and roll songs of all time.
8 minutes. And I think the real culprit of this album's shall we say lack of success is the drug cocaine. You can hear it on every song on this record, and you can hear it in Elton's performances, which are universally limp, lifeless, and they are relying on vocal effects to make him sound like he is in fact capable of having vocal inflections, like on the Johnny Be Good like vocal performance or other ones on here. He is fully into his mode where he's just hanging like this for whole time, and that's every line of this.
Elton has released a lot of albums, and I see this is notably the only one he's ever released where he has never played any of the songs live once.
Nope. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that some of these songs are songs like, I think easily the worst song on here, Street Boogie, which, I mean, title alone, pretty bad. Instrumentally, this record is certainly disco, but the degree to its authenticity of which it is disco is probably contested. Because you have a song like Street Boogie. It sounds like this song was made with an SNES sound font. This sounds like the soundtrack to a 16-bit video game. In fact, I think Street Boogie bears remarkable similarity to Mega Man 7's soundtrack, except it's not as competently arranged. It's so sloppy. And again, Elton John, the biggest, like one of the most notable things about him is sort of his partnership, his songwriting acumen with Bernie Taupin. And the songs on this album, lyrically, I'm just going to read you a little bit of Street Boogie here. Street guys walking, dancing. Sidewalk music, hot thing. They got their boxes tuned into their favorite show as they truck on down the road. Is that the radio? Yes, that's the radio. Let it go, let it go, let it go. Street Boogie got a hold of me. Street Boogie gonna set me free. Street Boogie keep a hold on me. It's all right, it's all right, it's all right with me. I think those 4 lines are the most commonly held like lyrical pop songwriting cliches in the history of music. And this is being performed by the guy who made Someone Save My Life Tonight. It is the most hollow, soulless thing I have maybe ever heard. There's just not an ounce of effort on Elton's part, on the production side. It is like listening to an empty Ziploc bag. As a result, it's not particularly interesting. It's not even worthy of being a curio. You just listen to it and you're like, wow, Elton's fall from grace and the, drug binge that he was on that very did nearly kill him. It certainly showed in his music there for a while too.
This type of album that feels like it was made because he lost a bet.
Even like look at that album cover. it looks like it looks like it was literally supposed to be in like a different aspect ratio, and they just took the photo wrong. And they're just like, put a big black border around it. I don't fucking know.
It reminds me of Lou Reed. Like, it looks like, and this whole thing sort of feels like the kind of shit post that Lou Reed would do, but
to get out of a record contract.
But just that Elton doesn't have that kind of, chaos energy that Lou Reed has to kind of make that feel like a cool thing to do. He's just trying to do something, and this feels like the kind of thing that he definitely knew the whole time was shit immediately as he was making it. And
it's
the mind just can only hypothesize as to what the thought process was, why this exists, and why it came out.
Bad.
My second pick today is an interesting example of an album that, now I don't know this for sure, but I feel fairly confident in making this assertion given that what I've read about, interviews I've read with the band, what I know about how this band responded to the fame that they initially accrued. And I want to talk about an album that old people forget exists. The album is the self-titled record from MGMT, the third album they put out, the follow-up to their 2010 album Congratulations, which was in itself a kind of reaction album to the immediate massive pop success of 2008's Oracular Spectacular, its huge singles, Electric Feel, Kids, the big songs on that album that made them a massive immediate pop name, and they were, very outwardly, clearly nerdy hipster dudes making pop music who were not seeking any kind of major fame and were kind of just a part of the niche. There were a dime a dozen bands like MGMT in 2008, and yet they struck onto something. Those songs were just so big that they were catapulted into the stratosphere, and they made one of the greatest reactions to massive pop success albums ever with Congratulations. That record is both a massive pivot into deeply uncool and deeply unfriendly sounds, and also a huge strengthening of what makes them such a great, fundamental, melodically sound and musically, psychedelically innovative band. Incredible album. Congratulations is about the coolest thing you can do after making a record like Oracular Spectacular. But where do you go from there? Like, do you go further down the rabbit hole? Do you change tack completely?
Indeed.
What's the game plan here? And so what we got in 2013 was what already felt like a very MGMT move in releasing a self-titled album. Like they were completely drawing a line under everything that had come before and reestablishing themselves, and it kind of started this. One of the things that hurts so much about this album to listen to is that it feels so much like a product of hating the process of making music and being completely disillusioned with the creative process completely. Because MGMT's self-titled is a musically barren album. It is a collection of sound that vaguely approximates musical ideas and flees from them at every turn. The best thing you can call it is interesting. The opening track, Alien Days, the lead single, has a few cute musical elements and moments. One of the only songs that feels like it has a coherent flow and progression within it. The second single, Your Life is a Lie, is a kind of fun novelty song, which I sort of like because it's just this booming guitar and cowbell sort of like 2-minute throwaway song that has a lot of sense of humor about what it is. And the rest of this album is nothing. It is complete stasis. I could not shake the feeling while revisiting it this week that this album was made by people who thoroughly resented making music and having to make music, who had absolutely no animus in their creative process whatsoever and were completely disillusioned. And it's actually a psychologically exhausting experience, especially when you know what this band are capable of. And what really cements this as a fascinating artifact as well is the fact that 4 years later they were able to bounce back from this as amazingly as they did with Little Dark Age, which is their best album, I think. And
yes,
the fact that they the fact that they've released two incredible, innovative, musically diverse and creative and just fantastically catchy albums in the form of Congratulations and Little Dark Age, and sandwiched right between them is this oasis of creativity, like this complete desert tumbleweed album. You know, the songs on this record start and end and nothing happens. Like, it is just a constantly iterating drone of humming psychedelic haze. It is just lifeless. Like, I've tried with this album. I tried when it came out. I revisited it this week to see if my perspective on it had shifted. And again, apart from some of the moments in Alien Days and the sheer cheek of Your Life is a Lie, there's nothing here. It just doesn't go anywhere. And especially in its second half, it just settles into this constant monotonous emptiness. And given what MGMT have said about how uncomfortable they were with the fame that they accrued with Oracular Spectacular, I can only assume that this is a purposeful decision to kind of almost kill the critical goodwill they got from pivoting with Congratulations. Like, this idea where no matter what they do, pleasing someone is something that they just gutturally, instinctively have to react against. And so it feels like an immensely cynical exercise. And I deeply resent the experience of listening to it. And I think it's a really bad album made by one of the best psychedelic pop bands of the last 15 years. So it's really fascinating that it exists. And I've seen people try to reclaim this. I understand the temptation. Believe me, I wanted to be able to do that too. But there's just nothing in MGMT's self-titled. And it is the most nothing album that a great band have, like a properly fantastic band, have released in some time. So, you know, happy 10th birthday to that particular piece of musical history. Jake, what is your next pick? Your final pick?
My next pick is that I've kind of gone in ascending order of how much I love these respective artists. And the artist of these picks that I love the most is most certainly King Crimson. One of the foundational prog rock bands. I mean, debatably the kind of fathers of the genre. I mean, there are few people who have contributed more to progressive music than the duo of Adrian Belew and Robert Fripp. I mean, just two musical masterminds who at their peak were basically unrivaled. And, you know, King Crimson, paradoxically, I think, are kind of an underrated band. Is that past, you know, the debut album, I feel like they're really not given enough credit for how creative they got. They pursued so many different sounds, so many different avenues of exploration that, you know, other bands like them wouldn't ever pursue because they were too, you know, set in their ways. That a lot of progressive bands just kind of did the same thing for a really long time and then stopped. And King Crimson never stopped trying new things. And I guess inevitably that just kind of leads you to the point where when you're late in your career, I don't ever really think that artists run out of ideas, but you're inevitably going to find yourself down the line and maybe just not know what to do, or maybe not have a specific direction in mind. And sometimes that can create something compelling. And sometimes it creates 2000s The Construction of Light. Bewilderingly spelled with a K.
That was a whole thing. Like,
yeah,
there was like Project 1, 2, and 3.
Prozac Blues with a K. Look, that is, to be blunt, the least of this album's problems. The biggest problem of this album is unquestionably the production. This thing sounds heinous. Like, this is maybe like some of the most disparity I've ever seen between an album that sounds like a 10 out of 10 and an album that sounds like a 1 out of 10. Like, you know, you have albums that have aged beautifully in their catalog, and this is so awful it had to be like re-recorded and remastered in another recording, which was the Reconstruction of Light, which frankly doesn't even solve all of this album's problems production-wise. It changes the fact that the sequenced drums on here are acoustic drums, which is an improvement to be sure, but man, it just does not change a lot of the fundamental issues, primarily the vocals. Every fucking line of this album is drenched in what sounds like vocoder effects. I don't know what the fuck they were thinking with this creative choice, but it is artificially deepened to the point where he sounds like a cartoon character. And it's just like, out of the gate, you fail. Like, with this one choice alone. Like, it doesn't matter what the rest of the album is. It could have been some of the best music they ever made. This stumbling block is enough to fuck you up for the rest of it. The fact that the rest of this is just some of the most cold and uncompelling material this band ever made it doesn't help, especially when you consider that they went on after this to make an album that was vastly superior to it in many ways. And I get it. They were trying for something on this record. They were going in a more experimental direction. They were going in a more industrial direction. That results in an album that sounds like metal ass. It sounds awful. There are moments on here of pure sound collage, like the world's my oyster soup kitchen floor wax museum, which is just pure music concrete nonsense, and it is maybe the most compelling thing on the album by merit of the fact that it is the messiest. The rest of it, I mean, like, there are parts of Lark's Tongues and Aspic, which is this, recurring motif throughout part 4 in their discography, where they make a new part to it gradually on different records. And this is easily the least essential part of this whole thing. I mean, every bit of every song on here, whether it be the soloing, whether it be the basic lyrical construction, which is often deeply fucking cringe as fuck. I mean, there are parts like Prozac Blues I've seen very frequently compared to, like, Tom Waits and his Nighthawks at the Diner phase, where he's like drunk off his ass, but he has like a weird electronic effect that's drenching his vocals. And then the rest of the album, man, it sounds like they're trying to do like a Les Claypool Primus type of thing, but there's no color in any of these songs. There's just no inspiration. There's nothing here that you would traditionally go to King Crimson, who are, again, progressive rock, I think, gets a bit of a bad rep these days, especially their era of it as being like a bunch of fuddy-duddy studio kind of prim proper, gotta make everything sound good, I'm a music nerd. But like, King Crimson were a frivolous, silly band. They were a fun band who often indulged themselves, not by being, traditionally self-indulgent in the progressive rock, like way that you might find in something like Dream Theater, but in ways that were avant-garde and interesting, and in ways that sustained them for very long amounts of time. And it doesn't even feel like it accidentally happens once on this entire
what I
thing.
think is, it's like, we did the flirting versus harassment meme, and it's like, flirting is Mike Patton, talking about Jizz Hitler and all this kind of, ridiculous shit that he talks about. And the harassment meme is Adrian Belew singing about alien cock and getting jiggy with it.
Getting jiggy with it. Yeah, that's that. It's trying to compensate for its lack of ideas with just like being weird, I guess, and it doesn't land at all. Like, even the Reconstruction of Light version, which is an improvement, it does not do enough to save any of the material on here, and it is, as one of your rating titles on Rate Your Music is, frequently regrettable.
Yeah, I mean, it is worth to say as well, emphasize its belonging here in the sense that The Power to Believe, the album that they followed up with, their last studio album, which also turned 20 the day before we record this,
Wow.
is a fantastic record, and
Yes.
really show that they were able to pull out the stops, to like a lot of great bands who I think have like a rough period towards the end, but then really pull it out for the final moment, like that last Rush album, for instance, as well as another sort of similar thing.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it just makes Construction of Light all the more baffling by comparison. My final pick today is probably I'd say probably the most famous album that we're talking about in this segment. Definitely the most heard, one of the most famous bands as well.
Got the
And
most famous
equally,
song for sure.
yeah, I mean, sure, it has songs that you will know. I mean, actually, it's debatable whether this has songs. It has it has musical ideas that repeat in a rhythmic fashion.
That's true.
The album is Daft Punk's Human After All. And, I've been a fan of Daft Punk since I was a kid. The album had already come out, I think, by the time I was like actually, into music and into following artists or whatever. So I never had to really experience the wait between 2000's incredible discovery and this album. But the thing about Daft Punk, and I should be on the record saying that I don't know if I would call it their best still, but I always have this instinct to say that Homework, their debut, is my favorite Daft Punk album, just because it's the one I've always heard the most. It is so fundamental to my early appreciation and understanding of dance music as a kid. And there's just something really elemental about that album. It's not fancy. It's not dulled up with colors and all that sort of stuff. It's raw house music at its most primal and primitive. And it has this heavy loudness to the way that it's mastered that makes it just completely irresistible to me. I love Daft Punk's Homework. And then Discovery is like the perfect follow-up to a record like that, right? It takes all those fundamental elements and then situates them in this much more expansive, colorful, melodic, and beautiful place where those core elements still make sense, but they're given this additional, development that makes them feel like eternal. So those are like two albums that need each other to fully exist and to make complete sense, and just are such a great, debut to follow up sort of thing. And where do you go from there? Like, Discovery is a huge album, huge songs, huge singles. I mean, by the time that they followed up with this album, I mean, Kanye West had already sampled Harder, Better, Faster, Stronger for on Graduation, right? So they were already incredibly well known, and they came at a time in the late 90s and early 2000s where their particular brand of incredibly pop influenced dance music that is so integrally situated within French house and that whole world was just perfectly primed to explode. And Human After All is a baffling album to kind of understand. It feels like obviously a step backward, because so much of the flair and color and just diversity of what made Discovery such a great leap forward is completely stripped away. And it's not even a return to the primitivism of Homework, because it is even more industrial and minimal and cold and static than that album was. That is a vibrant album that I think often gets mischaracterized. Homework does, but this album is almost like a purposeful execution of the concept of pure machinery, like the absolute absence of life, of humanity in this music. Like, it is a pure raw examination of machine making music. And, it does culminate in this, interesting exercise with the closing track Emotion, to imagine like what this and pure raw industrial machinery would sound like if it had to try and approximate a real human feeling. So I think there's a lot about what Human After All is that is kind of interesting to frame conceptually, but then you listen to the album and it is interminable. It's fairly short too. Like, it is the shortest Daft Punk album. But it is a complete slog. It is a wasteland. It is a completely unbearable listening experience. And the worst part about that is it feels intentional, and that makes me resent it more, even as I appreciate it in the abstract, as for the movement that it is and for what it says about Daft Punk's conceptual interests and their whole shtick. the fact that they are putting forward this incredibly, frankly, dull and trite and regressive exploration of ideas they had already established in previous records. It is the kind of thing a 12-year-old would find profound. The wheel and machinery of capitalism is like the machinery of the technology that we interact with in our everyday life or whatever. Like whatever the fuck Technologic is trying to be, whatever the fuck television rules the nation is trying to be, whatever the fuck steam machine is trying to be. It is not even a single idea that is run into the ground. It is a fragment of an idea that has no actual cohesive point to make. I mean, television rules the nation. The thing that makes Human, after all, like especially pointless is the fact that it almost feels like it exists solely as a place as like demos for material that will be used more interestingly in the Alive 2007 live album, where those songs were, and those elements of those songs made sense because they were being integrated into these kind of hyper constructed mixes with all their previous material. In that context, elements of those songs off this album, they still kind of don't fit that well, to be honest, but they are just flavoring in these bigger mixes on the live album. Here, it is like, it just feels like listening to demos. It feels like listening to loops of presets that the band are planning on using in one of their shows. It is a bizarre experience as a commercial release, not to mention all of the, the multimedia. I think they did a film in association with this as well. I forget what it's called, but they had a lot of media and a lot of promotion for this as well. I mean, there's, songs on this record that you might well know. The title track, which is probably the best song here, although it's much better on Alive 2007 when it's integrated with Rock and Roll from Homework and Superheroes from Discovery. God, I've listened to that so many times. You might know Robot Rock, which just has which is like one pretty cool, like very 70s laser sounding synth refrain. Completely just ran into the ground for 5 minutes. You might know Technologic, which is a song I thought was pretty cool as a kid and now physically pains me to listen to because it's just so unbearably stupid. That's probably the full extent of it, to be honest. There's one redeeming element of this album. The interstitial track Make Love in the middle of this record, which is almost like, feels a little bit like a joke because it's at complete odds with everything else on the record. It's a beautiful, like funky bass line, this really melancholic piano refrain, and this very human vocal loop. It's this gorgeous piece of music that's just stuck into the middle of this album, surrounded by sheer walls of Metal Machine music wannabe horseshit. It is a complete waste of time. And the fact that it is all, in terms of new material, that separates Discovery and Random Access Memories, records that are 13 years apart, only makes it feel like more glaring as a thing that exists. Like, I have to imagine how crushingly disappointed fans were when this came out. It is, and maybe that was assuaged by the fact that Alive 2007 came out the same year, but boy, I think in terms of bad albums from truly great artists, they maybe don't get more elementally direct and obvious and straightforward and completely, almost, again, deliberately stripping away the elements that make them meaningful than this. Because the core of what Daft Punk is repetition. That's everything they do, is just repetition. And you find a hypnosis, and you find ultimately, ideally, a kind of euphoria in it as well, is what they go for. And here it's like the whole point, the whole thing that you get from this band's fascinating exercises and explorations of repetition is a cold technical exercise. Like I like the particular film director that this reminds me of, but it feels like a Michael Haneke-esque album. Like, it is just
it's the long opening shot from Cachet in musical form.
Well, it's not even that, because that is something that has meaning and like layers of significance in the film when it's contextualized.
Well, that's the thing. It's just the shot without the rest of the movie.
It's like, yeah, what am I looking at here? Okay, we're observing. Cool. I'm going to start becoming as repetitive of this album as if I start kind of going into it more and more. But I think it is a definitive example of this exercise to me. It is an absolutely abysmal and fundamentally confusing album. And it's even more unacceptable given that Daft Punk have now broken up and they've only given us 4 albums and we have to pretend like this is one of them when it isn't. It isn't offensive, to call this an album and not just what it is, which is a very vague and pithy and childish intellectual exercise. And I hate it. And that brings us to the end of our discussion today. Let us know at home what you think of our picks, what you think of any of the varied topics and albums that we've discussed today. Lots to chew on. We want to hear what you think in the comments below. What are some of your favorite or most notable, most memorable examples of bad albums from artists you love? Let us know in the comments below. I want to see what you think. I want to see what you come up with. I'm sure there'll be some great suggestions that neither of us have thought of. So please do let us know. Check out our review of Gorillaz and Algiers from the other day if you haven't already, and stick around for our 20th anniversary celebration of Magnolia Electric Company by Songs I Hired. It's going to be a good one. Until next time, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Hallmark, when you care enough to send the very best.